Yes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Fadilah Ali. I am the Executive Director of GCFI. And before we get started with today's online workshop on non-detriment finding guidance for Queen Conch, we'll just go through a little bit of housekeeping. We do have live simultaneous interpretation from English to Spanish. To access interpretation on the bottom ribbon of your Zoom screen, you will see an icon that looks similar to a world. If you click on that, you can select either English or Spanish. For this workshop, we encourage you to use the chat to introduce yourself and communicate with other participants. However, for questions, we encourage you to use the question and answer box. We will do our best to answer questions during the question and answer session, but any unanswered questions will be done via a document that will be sent out after the workshop. So we will compile all questions and all questions will be answered, but due to time, we might not be able to answer during this workshop live. And so I believe we have everything set up. So to begin, we will start with welcoming remarks from Ms. Ivonne Higuero, who is the CITES Secretary General.
Distinguished participants, colleagues, and partners, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this important workshop on making non-detriment findings for Queen Conch or Strombus gigas, convened under the framework of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES. Queen Conch is not only an iconic species of the Caribbean, but also a vital resource supporting livelihoods, food security, and cultural heritage across its range states. International trade in Queen Conch products contributes significantly to local and national economies, underscoring the importance of ensuring that such trade remains legal, sustainable, and traceable. At the same time, we are all aware of the challenges facing the species, including overexploitation and illegal trade. This is precisely why non-detriment findings, or NDFs, are at the heart of CITES implementation. NDFs ensure that exports are based on sound scientific evidence and do not threaten the survival of the species in the wild, strengthening the parties' capacity to make robust, science-based NDFs is therefore essential for both conservation and sustainable use of CITES listed species. I am particularly encouraged to see the strong engagement in this workshop. More than 160 participants from Queen Conch range states have registered to take part in this training, which is organized by the CITES Secretariat in collaboration with our partner, the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute, and including several experts with years of experience in conch conservation and fisheries. This level of participation reflects the shared commitment of parties and other stakeholders to work together to improve management, data collection, and decision-making for this species. By strengthening cooperation among fisheries authorities, CITES management and scientific authorities, and regional partners, we can build a more coherent and effective approach to Queen Conch conservation and trade. In parallel, this will advance our progress toward achieving our shared goals for people and nature, such as those in the CITES Strategic Vision, Targets 5 and 9 on sustainable harvesting and trade of wild species within the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and of course, the Sustainable Development Goal 14, Life Below Water. Over the coming sessions, I encourage you all to share your experiences, challenges, best practices, and solutions. I invite all range states to assist the Secretariat by helping to test the species-specific guidance that has been developed for Queen Conch and providing feedback to us so that the guidance can be improved in the coming months. Let me conclude by emphasizing that sustainable trade is not incompatible with conservation. Conservation is part and parcel of wise use when supported by good science, effective management, and strong collaboration. I wish you all a productive and successful workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, CITES Secretary General, Ms. Ivonne Higuero. And to continue with the program today, I would like to extend welcoming remarks on behalf of the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute. GCFI is pleased to be partnering with the CITES Secretariat for a few years now to work on the issue of Queen Conch, and as well as developing this non-detriment finding guidance. And like Secretary General Higuero, I would like to encourage all participants to use the chat to really share your experiences and your perspectives, and this will really help when we start to refine this process. To continue, I would like to acknowledge that this work has been made possible thanks to funding provided by the United States National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, as well as the government of Switzerland. We are also especially honored to have three very incredible technical experts who have worked very hard to develop a lot of the materials that have been shared today, as well as the process of this NDF guidance. So firstly, Dr. Richard Appledurn is a retired professor of marine science from the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez. He has 45 years of experience working on the biology, population dynamics, survey methods, and fisheries of Queen Conch, and he has published extensively on these. He's a long-standing member of the Scientific and Statistical Committee of the Caribbean Fisheries Management Council and has also served as advisor to its Queen Conch initiative, as a member of the Queen Conch Scientific and Statistical Advisory Group of the WCAFC Queen Conch Working Group. And he's also an advisor to a number of Caribbean countries on Queen Conch assessments. We also have Dr. Nelson Earhart. He is a professor emeritus of fisheries at the Residential School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science at the University of Miami. He holds an MSc and PhD degrees from the University of Washington and has 58 years of experience as a fisheries scientist carrying out marine population analyses and fishery stock assessments. He has studied and exploited population dynamics of Queen Conch in the Bahamas, Honduras, and Nicaragua, and has conducted work on Queen Conch through the FAO, CITES, WCAFC, CFMC, and also with GCFI. Most recently, in 2023, he co-authored a consultancy on improving fishery statistics in the Queen Conch fisheries of Jamaica. And then also, Dr. Alexander Tufik is a benthic ecologist with more than 30 years of experience working with academic and research institutions and NGOs in tropical marine ecosystems, primarily in the Caribbean, as well as Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. His experience includes field research on populations and small-scale fisheries of Queen Conch across the region. His interests lie primarily in how anthropogenic disturbances, including fishing and nutrient enrichment, impact ecosystem structure, trophic dynamics, and human well-being. And so from those bios, you can see we have more than 100 years of experience on conch right here, providing the technical expertise for this workshop. And in terms of the structure of the workshop, today is really about setting the scene. We'll start off with an introduction to the workshop, and also within day one, we'll provide the scientific, technical exploited population dynamics to provide the foundation that we need to discuss day two, where we go into the Queen Conch NDF scoring systems and then providing example theoretical scoring examples, and really having a deep dive into any questions and answers, and then following up with the next steps of this process. So I will now hand over to Ms. Karen Gaynor, who is a scientific support officer with the CITES Secretariat, to provide an introduction to the workshop. For those of you who have just joined, interpretation is available on the lower panel. You will see a globe, and you can select the language that you wish to listen in. And we encourage you throughout the presentations, if you do have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box, and we will try to, all questions will be answered, but not all will be done live. So thank you, and over to you, Karen.
Yes, thank you very much, Fadilah, for the introduction. And As you can see, the wealth of experience we have had the benefit of being able to draw on from the experts that you just introduced. I'm just going to share my screen here. You can let me know when you can see it. I think I might be the wrong one. Hold on 1 second. This worked a second ago. Here we go. Okay, hopefully you can see it now. Yeah.
Not yet.
It's a
Yeah,
present here. Oh,
it's
go on.
on now.
Okay, great. Um, okay, I'm not sure. Presenter mode. Here we go. Yeah. Okay, so just to introduce myself, I am Karen Gaynor. I'm the Scientific Support Officer for Fauna at the CITES Secretariat. I have worked there for 10 years, and before that, I worked in the Scientific Authority in Ireland. So I am aware of the requirements for non-detriment findings from the point of view of a party and also from the point of view of the Secretariat. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce this and give you some introductory remarks about maybe a reminder about what NDF is to set the scene for this workshop. So just to give you an outline of my presentation, I'll first give you a very brief history of Queen Conch in CITES, discuss what does an Appendix 2 listing mean for trade in Queen Conch, and then we will have an introduction to non-detriment findings, looking at the guiding principles. What are non-detriment findings? Why are they needed? Who does them, etc. And then we will look in particular at the development of the Queen Conch NDF guidance, which we will be discussing today and tomorrow. I will also highlight the CITES NDF project, which was broader than the Queen Conch project, but they are sympathetic towards each other, but they did run in parallel. So some of the outcomes of this CITES NDF project will have an impact on the updating of the guidelines for the Queen Conch NDF, and I will go into that in a little bit more detail later. And then we will just briefly outline the workshop objectives. So to start out, a brief history of Queen Conch in CITES. You will recall that Queen Conch was listed on Appendix 2 of CITES at COP8. So that was in November of 1992. There are 36 Queen Conch range states and dependent territories. And Queen Conch is mainly traded as meat or shells, sometimes as opercula or pearls. And it's important to know that there are some exemptions for the trade. So under Resolution Conf 13.7, Rev COP 17, on control of trade in personal and household effects, a person is allowed to have up to 3 Queen Conch shells for personal or household effects without the need for a CITES permit. I should say though that there are some countries, although this is a general rule, there are some countries who impose stricter domestic measures and for which this exemption will not apply. So since it was listed in CITES in 1992, Queen Conch has been selected on several occasions for the review of significant trade. So the review of significant trade, if you are not aware of it, is the process by which the trade is reviewed at the first meeting of the Animals and Plants Committees. It'll be the Animals Committee for Queen Conch after each COP, so Conference of the Parties. At that, the trade for the previous 5 years is reviewed, and some cases, so some species country combinations, where there are concerns about the levels of trade, the sustainability of the trade. So if there's a sharp increase in the global trade, a sharp increase from an individual party, an increase in a threatened species, then this is when the country will be asked to show the non-detriment finding it made for that trade. So normally we don't, as the Secretariat or the committees, do not ask to see the non-detriment findings unless the species has been selected for the review of significant trade. So this is important to remember. But under the review of significant trade, I think it has gone through 3 times. CITES has proposed a range of actions in the mid-90s and again between 2003 and 2005 to improve the sustainability and the legality of the trade in Queen Conch. So these recommendations, these actions, were favourably acted by most of the Caribbean countries and dependent territories where Queen Conch occurs. And the measures and the recommendations that were implemented included things like establishing export quotas, temporary trade suspensions, harmonised fishery rules, and better trade controls. And it's important to note that the RFMOs, or the Regional Fisheries Management Organisations, fully supported these efforts. And finally, inclusion of Queen Conch in CITES has resulted in funding and technical support for the species. It has targeted research efforts, and it has led to an improved understanding of the ecology and management of the species. It doesn't mean that we know everything about it, but it has certainly brought a focus onto Queen Conch that might not have been there in the absence of a CITES listing. So what does an Appendix 2 listing mean for trade in Queen Conch? Just to start out by saying that CITES only regulates international trade. It doesn't have any effect on domestic trade or national trade. So harvesting from the sea just to sell within the country, CITES doesn't have any impact on that. However, for international trade in a CITES 2 list, in Appendix 2 listed species like Queen Conch, it requires 2 things. So the first thing it requires is a legal acquisition finding, or an LAF. And what this is a legal acquisition finding is where the management authority of the state of export is satisfied that the specimen was not obtained in contravention of the laws of the state for the protection of fauna and flora. And the second thing it needs is a non-detriment finding, and that's the focus of what we will be discussing today and tomorrow. And this differs from the legal acquisition finding because this one is done by the scientific authority, and the scientific authority of the state of export has advised that such export will not be detrimental to the survival of the species. So you may have heard that the 3 pillars of CITES are legality, sustainability, and traceability. So the LAF is the legality, the NDF is the sustainability, and once you have both of those, these are satisfied, then we go to the traceability, which is the export permit. Now, the export permit should not be issued without a legal acquisition finding and a non-detriment finding. So this is really important. Although this is not the focus of today's and tomorrow of this workshop, I thought it was important just to give you a couple of resources on legal acquisition finding. But noting that the legal acquisition finding is actually conducted by the management authority. So there is a resolution, so Resolution Conf 18.7 on legal acquisition findings, and this sets out the general principles that parties should use to verify legal acquisition, of specimens to be exported. And there's also a rapid guide for making legal acquisition findings. And this outlines a key set of minimum steps that management authorities should take into account when they are establishing and following processes to make legal acquisition findings. But of course, we are really here to focus on the non-detriment findings. So I wanted to highlight some of the guiding principles when it comes to non-detriment findings. So Articles 3 and 4 of the Convention require the advice of a scientific authority that a proposed action will not be detrimental to the survival of a species. And as I mentioned earlier, this advice is effectively a decision that must be made by the scientific authority. But what is it? So essentially, an NDF is a risk assessment based on scientific information, the best available information at the time. But the reality is that it is typically based on incomplete data. I don't think there's any situation where any species can say, or country can say that they know all of the information about a particular species. Important to note that the non-detriment finding requirement only applies to Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. It is not required for Appendix 3 listed species. And as I mentioned previously, if your country, the trade in Queen Conch is selected for the review of significant trade, that is when you will be asked to provide your NDF to show that the trade is sustainable. And as I said, some importing countries who have stricter domestic measures may also ask to see your NDF. So there's a couple of important terms when we talk about risk assessment. So risk, what do we mean by risk and uncertainty? So a risk is something that can be identified and measured. So you will know their probability and the impact that is predicted. But uncertainty is an unexpected event. So you can't predict the probability of it happening or the severity of it happening. So if you look at this little graph here, this is in relation to the risks. So if you have a low risk with a low impact and a low probability, this will be a good scenario. But if you have a risk that would have a high impact on something and there's a high probability of it occurring, then that brings you into the red in the top right corner of the graph. But it's important to recognize that unless you identify the risks, so you need to know what the risks are to the species, you cannot put measures in place to mitigate against the impact of these risks. So when we talk about risks, usually biological factors are what we think about when we identify risks. So here you will see a little chart with looking at the life history trait gradients and also the geographic and exploitation gradients. So these are factors that you would know about the biology of the species, you would know about the geographical occupancy. So whether you're talking about a scattered, fragmented population or a large population. And then if you are talking about a K-selected species, so a small number of offspring reproduces not very frequently, but that the offspring have a very high chance of surviving to adulthood, versus an or-selected species where they reproduce frequently. They have large broods of offspring because there's a low probability of the the juveniles surviving to adulthood. So to increase the chances of some of them surviving to adulthood, they reproduce more often. So understanding the biology of the species can help you identify what potential risks could be. But when we talk about uncertainties, we're generally talking about socioeconomic, legal, and political factors that are very hard to predict. And the impact of these is also hard to know. Data availability and quality is another big factor. So obviously, the quantity and the quality of the data will vary, and there will always be gaps in the knowledge, and that's why we say that the non-detriment finding is based on the best available information at the time. But as your information increases, and we will look at this shortly, but as the information, more information becomes available, then you need to update and adapt your NDF. If we look at this, this is a 4-box model that is commonly used in IPBES, and this shows that as the quality and the quantity of the evidence on the x-axis becomes more robust, you've got greater certainty, and when there's more agreement that this is the quality of the data is strong, then you can be very certain of your confidence in the data that you have got available. But of course, the data requirements, they should be proportionate to the vulnerability of the species concerned. There's no need to have extensive data if we're talking about a very low level of trade in a very resilient species. So a species that's not very vulnerable, then you probably don't need the same level of data to be sure that the offtake is sustainable compared to a situation where you have a high potential level of trade in a species that is highly vulnerable. Well, then you're going to need a lot more quality data to be able to say that any offtake is sustainable. So what do we do in this situation where data is missing or the quality of the data is not very robust? Well, this is where the precaution and safeguards comes in. So the precaution is a way of responding to or mitigating against risks and uncertainty. And again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, precautionary measures should be proportionate to the risks of the species, but they should also be in the best interests of the species. So again, if you look at this graph here, you can see that as the vulnerability of the species increases compared to the volume of the trade, the greater the vulnerability of the species and the higher the volume of trade, then the higher the risk is to the species. And this is when you need to have more quality of data and greater precaution and safeguards in place. But this, you will, somewhere in the middle, we have this situation where there's a moderate risk. So it could tolerate some level of trade. And the vulnerability of the species maybe falls somewhere in the middle. And this is where you can consider conditional NDFs, where you implement safeguards to reduce the risks. And some of the measures that you could use in these conditional NDFs include quotas, limits on harvest, or spatial, so closing off specific areas, or for specific times of the year, for example, when the species is reproducing. So this is what I referred to earlier as adaptive management. So you don't do an NDF once and then that's it. As you gain more information, as new risks emerge, as new uncertainties become perhaps more prevalent, then you adapt and you're constantly learning by doing. So for an NDF process, you take a structured, iterative process to make the best decisions despite those risks and uncertainty and imperfect knowledge. So you'll never have a situation where you know absolutely everything, you know all the risks, you know the probability of everything happening. But these are the fundamental elements of a risk assessment. And again, then the scale and the complexity of this adaptive management, it can be adjusted depending on the risks. So you may, for example, if you had a storm that wiped out some of the population, well, then you're not going to be able, the population is not going to be able to sustain the same level of offtake in subsequent years. So you might have to reduce the harvest to allow the population to recover. And then once it's recovered, then you can increase it again. So it's a constant adaptive process based on the information you have and taking into account all of the different factors. So it's very important that there is a feedback loop based on monitoring. That's integral to the approach, and it increases the confidence that management achieves no detriment to the wild populations. So if we think of this in practice, what this really means is a three-step process. So the first step, and it's a circular process. So the first step is to review the available information and the risks, to design a management plan with safeguards, and agree a monitoring methodology and indicators at the outset. Then you implement this, and then you monitor the outcome. but again, over a defined period of time. So you might do it on an annual basis, you might do it every 5 years. Um, and based on the findings from the monitoring, then you would evaluate that and adjust the plan. And if necessary, adjust the NDF finding. Um, so using the example that I gave, you may decide that it is not possible to make a non-detriment finding at the moment, but then you implement more safeguards, you monitor that, and when the situation has improved, then you can change your finding. So, oh, sorry, something has stalled. There we go. So even though CITES came into force in 1975, and the non-detriment finding is fundamental to the convention in terms of showing sustainability, we did not have a resolution or any guidance on making non-detriment findings until COP16. So it took 40 years before this first resolution was adopted. So resolution Conf 16.7 on non-detriment findings, it recommends concepts and non-binding guiding principles regarding NDF methodologies. An NDF can result, as I said earlier, is a science-based risk assessment, and it can take the form of a written advice from the scientific authority, a verbal advice from the scientific authority, or a quota based on an NDF by the scientific authority for a specific period of time. And that's usually on an annual basis. Verbal advice would only be used very, very rarely where there is a very low risk to the trade, and it's a very low species with low vulnerability. And in the vast majority of cases, it would always need a written advice. And again, from the scientific authority. So the complexity of the assessment and its data requirements should reflect the origin and the type of the specimen, and it should be proportionate to the vulnerability of the species concerned. So this resolution recommends general criteria and indicators that should be assessed to determine whether the proposed trade is detrimental or not. It recommends sources of information that may be considered when making this assessment, encourages the sharing of information, and it directs the Secretariat to maintain the NDF database. So let's have a look at the development of the Queen Conch NDF guidance. So here's a little timeline. It's a little bit colourful, but I hope you can see this. So if you start over on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see in 1975, CITES enters into effect. And in 1992, Queen Conch is listed in Appendix 2. Then 2008, if we're moving along the blue arrow from left to right, in 2008, there was the first CITES NDF workshop, which was held in Cancun in Mexico. And I think it was Colombia presented a case study on Queen Conch. But what this workshop did not do was produce any overarching guidance that could be applied. But it was a very useful workshop for presenting different case studies and different scenarios as to how different countries and different parties were making their non-detriment findings. Then in a COP16, which was in 2013, sorry, I forgot to add the year there, that's when the first resolution on non-detriment findings was adopted. Then in 2016, we had COP17, and this is where the first set of decisions on Queen Conch was adopted. So a lot of this came from the Queen Conch having been through the review of significant trade, and the parties wanted to continue to review and to move forward on Queen Conch conservation. So when those decisions were adopted, WCFC, its Secretariat agreed to start working on the development of non-detriment finding guidance specific to Queen Conch. And there was the development of preliminary NDF guidance with WIC-FC, FAO, and CITES. But that guidance was felt to be a little bit too complicated. And so it wasn't actually presented at a meeting, but it did form a solid foundation for the start of the discussions on NDF guidance for Queen Conch. Then we move into 2019 at COP18, and we had more decisions on Queen Conch. I think it was the original decisions renewed, but we also had the adoption of decisions on the CITES NDF project. This work started on the CITES NDF project started in 2019. I will go into that in a little more detail. But then we have a COP19 in 2022, more decisions on Queen Conch and the CITES NDF project. So this work continued. But in 2022, this is when, thanks to the funding from NOAA that we heard about earlier, the Secretariat engaged GCFI and this pool of renowned conch experts to start working on the NDF guidance for Queen Conch. So that started in 2022. It built up. The first version was presented at the workshop in Nairobi, the CITES NDF workshop, in 2023. The version that was presented at that, I will explain later, did not take it ran parallel with the NDF workshop, the CITES NDF workshop. So these two processes were sympathetic, they overlapped, but I think there's a little bit work to be done now to try to merge them so that the terminology and was agreed in this CITES NDF workshop is reflected in the NDF Queen Conch guidance. But after the workshop, there was additional feedback, there was additional updates and new versions. So the version that we are seeing today at this workshop has developed from the NDF, from the work that was done before 2023. But this, as you see, the arrows continue to go on past the right-hand side of the slide. So that's where we will come into the next step. So this is a work in progress, both for the NDF project and also for the Queen Conch. So we've already heard a little bit about the experts, the three experts that we have here today, but I also wanted to mention Ms. Martha Prada from Puerto Rico and Mr. Gilbert Kong, who were also very active in the development of this NDF guidance. So the Queen Conch NDF guidance, I won't go into it in much detail. You're going to hear about this a lot, but there are two parts to the guidance. There is the full guidance manual, and then there is an Excel guidance workbook that has an individual sheet for each of the steps throughout the process, and then an evaluation worksheet and a scoring system. I just did want to point out that the version that was previously presented at the NDF workshop in Nairobi consisted of 10 steps. However, in light of the outcomes of the CITES NDF project, which ran in parallel with this, the 10 steps will probably be reduced. So I've mentioned the CITES NDF project a few times. So I wanted to give a little bit more information about this. So it started at COP18 with the adoption of these decisions. The first step was for the Secretariat to undertake a gap analysis to review all of the NDF material that was publicly available, looking at what languages the NDFs were available in, what taxa, what the geographical spread was. And most of this was resources or NDFs that had been included in the NDF database or had been provided to the Animals or Plants Committee under the review of significant trade. So based on this gap analysis, COP19 agreed or adopted decisions to take this work forward. So this involved setting up a technical advisory group, which continued to work on this. It was a long iterative process, and that fed into an international workshop that was held in Nairobi in 2023. And this was the Queen Conch draft NDF guidance was also presented at this workshop. The NDF guidance was reviewed at the 33rd meeting of the Animals Committee and the 27th meeting of the Plants Committee. And then the whole guidance was launched at COP20, which was last November, December. So I mentioned the gap analysis. So items or the Secretariat or gaps that the Secretariat identified that could do with some additional guidance included guidance for making NDFs in low capacity situations, which is obviously very important. Guidance for making NDFs in low risk situations. So do you always need to make a detailed non-detriment finding? And guidance for making NDFs in low data situations, which many countries will have come across. Guidance for ranch specimens of animal species and assisted production specimens of plant species. How do you incorporate traditional knowledge into NDFs? Guidance illustrating the concept and the definition and implementation of assessing a species' role in its ecosystem. And guidance for implementing participatory species monitoring, management, and decision-making. And then the following taxonomic groups were identified as priority. So terrestrial mammals, birds, fish, invertebrates, and rosewoods and palisanders. So the Secretariat brought this to the COP. And then when the technical advisory group was established, the following 11 work streams were identified. We worked in collaboration with IUCN. These 11 work streams worked in parallel. These are the 11 topics that were agreed. And each work stream had a working group lead. But it was important that the working groups in each of these work streams included members from parties, IGOs, NGOs, and individual experts. So it was a very broad stakeholder engagement. So these work streams developed comprehensive modules, which were then submitted to the NDF workshop in Nairobi. So this was the group that went to Nairobi. As you can see, it is a very broad group of people, and perhaps there are some people in the audience who participated at that workshop. So ultimately, we've ended up with 17 modules. So there are 3 generic modules. So there's an introduction and preamble, there's principles and concepts of NDFs, and then practical considerations for making NDFs. So these are the 3 sort of overarching generic modules. Then there's 10 thematic modules, the 10 in green. And these deal with specific issues, but the one I wanted to highlight in relation to Queen Conch is module 5. It looks like it's 6 here, but that's module 0 is the preamble. So this is module 5, which is NDFs for aquatic species. So there are some elements in that module which are also relevant to Queen Conch. And then there are 4 supporting modules which contain online tools and certifications and their relevance to NDFs. There's a set of templates, case studies. I think the Queen Conch was actually included in these case studies, and also a glossary of terms. So this is how they are divided up. We have the two generic, and then the thematic and supporting modules. And this is what they all look like, all the different publications. So if you want to see where they are, if you would like to review these, you can find them on the CITES webpage if you click on the implementation tab, and then go to CITES non-detriment findings. You will find them there, or you can scan any of these QR codes. So all of the guidance is available in English, Spanish, and French. But it is important to note, as I mentioned earlier, that the results of the CITES NDF project were not available when the draft of the NDF guidance for Queen Conch was produced. So the results of that project have yet to be incorporated into the Queen Conch guidance, in particular the agreed terminology in several of the modules, specifically modules 1, 2, and 5. If you're familiar with the previous guidance that was presented on Queen Conch, there are steps 1 to 3, which now seem to closely correlate with the initial information gathering or pre-checks in the NDF project guidance. And so the intention is to, while they remain in the current draft to avoid the need for extensive amendments at this stage, the intention is that the final draft will be updated to remove these 3 steps into this initial information gathering. So just to give you an idea of the initial information gathering, the sort of questions that are asked. This is for a generic Appendix 2 listed species, not specific to Queen Conch. But some of these questions are overlapping with the questions that were in steps 1 to 3. So is the species correctly identified and named? Well, we know it's in Appendix 2. Is it exempted? Is the species exempted or excluded from CITES controls? And for Queen Conch, no. Have recommendations been issued to suspend trade in the species being exported? There have been trade suspensions in the past, and at the moment there is still one for Haiti, is subject to a recommendation to suspend trade, but Haiti is not a CITES party. And then what is the quantity of specimens to be exported? Describe the specimen. What's the source of the specimens? Is it wild or captive bred, artificially propagated in the case of a plant? What's the purpose of those exports? Is it commercial trade? Is it scientific? Where will they be harvested from? Or where were they harvested? What's the scale of the current NDF? So has the NDF been done at the national level or just for a particular area? And then what sort of national legislation is in place in relation to that particular species? So I'm nearly at the end here, just at the introduction. I just wanted to make a few points about the objectives and the hopes of this workshop. So the first objective is to introduce the species-specific NDF guidance for Queen Conch. Some of you may be familiar with it already, but as I said, this is an updated version, but this is not the final version. Because the intention is to collect feedback on the guidance. This is, as we said, this is guidance, so it is really important that range states let us know whether the guidance is useful, it's practical, it's understandable, where you find any challenges, you have any questions where something is not clear or something doesn't seem to make sense when you're actually going through the process, and propose some improvements. Because if you can help us to actually develop this, make it as useful as possible for you, then this is your opportunity to do that. And what we would like to do is also come up with a list of frequently asked questions. So there may be some issues questions that many of you have. So we hope to compile sort of a document of frequently asked questions. Hopefully we can answer some of the questions during this workshop, but we will put together a document that will be useful for all of you in relation to Queen Conch and making NDFs. And what we want to do then is to invite all the range states to test the guidance and then to go away after the workshop, once you've understood from the training how to go through the worksheets and how to do the scoring, and then provide additional feedback after the workshop. So subject to the availability of funding and of course the number of range states that are willing to participate in the testing phase, feedback may be sought either through a questionnaire, an online workshop, or an in-person regional regional meeting later this year. So the more people, the more countries that can get involved and help with the testing, then we will be able to have a feedback on a larger scale. So it's really important that as many of you as possible are willing to help us to test this. So because the guidance will be updated based on the feedback that is received. And then that guidance, this updated guidance, will be made available to the parties, the range states, and also we will report on the outcome to the Animals Committee. And in this regard, I would just issue a plea and encourage those range states who have not yet compiled the questionnaire that was sent to each of the CITES authorities in the relevant range states to do so, to complete it, and to then submit it to the Secretariat as soon as possible. I hope tomorrow to present a summary of the questionnaires that we have received, and to those who have submitted their questionnaires, I would like to extend my thanks to you for doing so. But I would encourage those who have not done so yet to try to do so as soon as possible. Please also let us know if you have not received, if your country has not received the questionnaire. We sent this out through the CITES contacts on the CITES website, down as your national contacts. But if it did not reach you, or you would like me to send another copy of the questionnaire, then please let us know. So that's what I wanted to say about the questionnaires. I will go in a little bit more detail about the feedback, and so the next steps and how we will engage with countries, and also the possibility of some range states receiving targeted support, so some comprehensive support. But I would just stress that anyone who wants some support, we will endeavour, and I hope be able to provide support to anyone who is willing to help to test the guidance. So that's all I wanted to say for now. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your engagement with this process. Thank you.
And thank you, Karen, for helping to set the scene, provide some history on the process, and then also establish what the objectives are for this workshop. Next, we are going to move on to Dr. Nelson Earhart to take us through exploited queen conch population dynamics that drive NDF decisions. Over to you, Nelson.
All right, thank you so much. Do you see now?
Not yet.
Just a minute, please. What about now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the opportunity of participating in this important webinar. As Karen was saying, the issue with NDFs is that we may have a frame of conceptual items that can contribute to the NDF. And the second issue is how to identify those items that are important. In the identification of the items is where the science, the information, the experience, etc., play a role, which is very important. Since NDFs, we said that is a sort of based on risk assessment. Risk assessments are obviously related to probability outcomes. And those probability outcomes are usually based on the quality of the data, the trends we see in the data as a consequence of exploitation in the case of the conch, and obviously related to the very complex ecology and exploited population dynamics of the conch. The conchs are highly vulnerable because they are easy to catch, especially when the mating and spawning season happens. When these animals get together, then diving can catch them in larger numbers as opposed to those seasons when they spread out on the continental shelf, etc. The queen conch is perhaps one of the best known in terms of their ecology of all the species in the Caribbean because it has been studied extensively. However, it is a species that appears to be one that the more we study it, the less we understand it. And that is to mean there is a discovery process in place, and that discovery process leads to different decisions on how to exploit, how to use or not to use the resource. Thirdly, there is an issue in terms of what is the surplus yield. Surplus yield is what we can crop from the population without affecting the sustenance of the population. And in the case of the conch, it's not the sustenance of the fishery, but the sustenance of the population by regulating the fishery. And sometimes these issues are not well understood when there is a huge demand for the product. And therefore, there are two issues with this surplus production in these animals. One is the amount that you can consume locally, and what is the fraction of that surplus that can be exported. And there appears to be some misunderstanding of what is an export quota relative to the surplus yield of the resource in a given area. And therefore, what we are presenting here is not with the purpose of discussing differences in scientific discovery, but rather we are presenting here some ideas, lines of thoughts on what should be included in the process of risk assessment that is required for the NDF. So therefore, I will start very quickly enumerating three things: the what, the why, and the how. The what is the problem identification that we would like to resolve. The why is because there is obviously a huge risk at exploiting this species. And the how is the set of structured questions and protocols that need to be implemented for the NDF to be developed. So the what initially is scientific evidences that we need regarding the status of exploitation that generates the need for management and maintain the reproductive population density rates at levels above an established minimum threshold for population sustenance. That is obviously a concern that brings directly to the core of the problem, which is the ALE effect that occurs when the reproductive density decrease, bringing mating rates below the effective levels that could impair long-range recruitment. This obviously is similar to the case of marine mammals, where you exploited the whales, for example, many years ago, and the Whaling Commission was so concerned about it, and incredible mathematical models were developed for this. How do we exploit a stock that by exploiting it, we reduce their population densities and animals cannot encounter each other to mate? The case of the conch is even more critical in the sense that their mobility is really reduced to a very minimum compared with other species. While whales, they have ways to communicate, to encounter and swim distances, etc. The conchs, they can only move a few meters per day. And therefore, the problem of population range and the habitat range of the individuals are two different principles, two different concepts that one has to consider when developing these NDFs. Then how do we do this? It's a set of structured questions, and here is the first problem we encounter. A set of structured questions. Those questions have to be questions addressing the survivability of the species and the sustainability of the population by means of escaping exploitation. And therefore, this goes directly addressing to the works of the CITES scientific authorities in the different countries regarding, first of all, species identification, quite obviously. But what is more important is what is underlined there, to know about landings, valid fishery statistics, and by valid fishery statistics, we mean valid with respect to the population. We can collect statistics in a corner of the animal distribution in a given country, but those statistics may not be valid for the entire population and therefore affecting the NDF consequences. Stock assessments are difficult because most of the stock assessment techniques that have been used in the past with Queen Conch fisheries are based or inherited from fish stocks, and conchs cannot be, as far as we think, from fish stocks, and therefore the problem of the LE effect has to be included in the stock assessment models, and that is not a simple matter that we will see this morning. And then finally, the quota definitions for conservation and development of regulations, and obviously the enforcement of the regulations. All of these things are the how this NDF's score system can be evaluated. If a country doesn't have a way to enforce, probably the score will be very, very low and the risk of conservation very high. So those type of things, those type of discussions during the development of the NDF are obviously required. And we hope that by presenting what we are doing right now this morning is to provide the basic information that tomorrow, when we go through the actual implementation of the NDF, the examples, etc., we use some simplified scoring system as a monitoring program for key performance indicators. And please pay attention to a monitoring program for these performance indicators. We will discuss performance indicators in a few minutes. And then it comes the actual NDF development, coupling the existing fishery resources information with the strategic score evaluations. So what you will see in the training starting tomorrow is precisely a strategic score evaluation on how to do the business of building up a scoring system and a final score. In what follows, I will continue with this 1 to 5. And first of all, the what, we go back there again. The general Queen Conch NDF is a scoring system that is suggested for applications when it's not possible to implement formal statistically valid Queen Conch stock assessment, which is generally the case in the area. But here we need to pay attention that you don't have to have a formal, complete stock assessment to understand that the stock is being sort of being overutilized, overexploited, or simply well maintained. You need a few indices that probably you need fewer pieces of information, but those pieces of information, they have to have a very clear and safe based on the statistical validity in which the sampling took place. And it is defined as a method for assigning a level of risk that the queen conch population or individuals, in this case is density, based on multiple relevant parameters and exploitation conditions that may be combined to produce an overall score. So the relevant parameters that we need to use are the ones that we have to identify this morning in the sense of which are the main population dynamics aspects of the conchs that they need to be considered when developing these NDFs. So the resulting queen conch NDF is an overall score that allows identification of exploitation risks following a standardized method for assigning numerical values or grades, if you wish, to system components. And the system components are the ones that have to be first identified before you go into the NDF development, such as scientific understanding and predefined criteria or parameters governing exploitation. By aggregating the data then, there are various indicators. The scoring system converts complex information into a single actionable and interpretable metric. This metric is the score that allows for comparison, classification, and decision-making regarding desired objectives, that is, the level of sustained population reproductive capacity. I mark this again as the important central core of the entire NDF development, the level of sustained population reproductive capacity. These animals are extremely exposed to exploitation, and if this is not being managed, let us say, in a proper way, there is no doubt that the impact is going to be great. The scores trends then may be expressed historically. If you do this every other year or every year, depending on the ability to do these things, historically you're going to have a trend, and these trends may dictate the conditions of population sustenance. And it is especially valuable if there is going to be future reviews of the fisheries in some of the countries, and you have a well documented historic process of the exploitation of the biology and ecology of these animals. The why, first of all, data exists today that declares that density, in fact, is affecting the ability to reproduce of these animals. And this is through different indices from different sources of data. Dr. Stoner provided this information, which is extremely valid, and we fitted a very complex model here. But the important thing is that it appears that when the density of these animals is very high, they may interfere among each other in terms of mating that could be affecting the reproductive capacity. On the other hand, if the density is very low, they don't encounter each other, and this goes to zero. So that is one example of the generality of the problem of density dependence of recruitment that affects the long-range sustainability of the use of the surplus yield. Also, very important is the fact that this density effect on the probability of mating may differ within areas. This is for the Bahamas, for example, and you see that in different keys in the Bahamas, you have not only a different shape of this, but a different slope of this. So the consequences are drastically different. From this case, for example, that you start exploiting this coming down, you don't see the effect of the coming down of the density, but all of a sudden there is a collapse. While in this case, it's kind of telling you, be careful, be careful, be careful. You have a time to react. So all these very dynamic issues, quite obviously, they need to be asked, and there is a need to assign a risk where you are in terms of the type of effect of density on reproductive biology, or how is this general trend, for example, with some data that we plotted different models here, and we have then that we go from spawning population density to reproductive index, and how this reproductive index is related to recruitment with different models, to finally arrive at the population level, the density of the population level, and what is happening then with an index of recruitment, because this is what is the final interest on this. And despite of the extreme differences between the initial models, the consequences of reducing density here, population density, is definitely much more significant as a sudden collapse when we are dealing with this type of biology as when we are dealing with this type of biology, etc. So the question here is how vulnerable these animals become because of this ALE effect that is more significant or less significant according to different areas, different levels of exploitation, etc. The how this is generated, this is the spinal cord of what we develop for the NDFs. The exporters are applying for a permit to export this, and that is in charge of the CITES Management Authority. And an NDF request is sent to the CITES Scientific Authority in the country, and the evaluation for the NDF starts. And this is what you will be dealing with tomorrow, starting tomorrow, in the sense that, first of all, there is a need to evaluate conservation concerns, and you have there a set of questions that had to do with the rationale used for the Queen Conch placement in Appendix 2, the density dependence of recruitment. If that has a low concern, that is to mean everything seems to be okay, then you go to the next step to evaluate the biological risk of exploitation. And then from there, if it's okay, you go to evaluate the impacts of harvest. And here is where the complexities become really complex, in the sense that you need to have an idea on how these stocks have been declining or increasing, growing in stock abundance, etc. Therefore, there is a need to understand the fisheries. And by understanding the fisheries, we mean you understand who are those exploiting the resource, being artisanal, being industrial, different types of gear being used, etc. And especially what part of the population range is the one that is being impacted by exploitation. And the reason is very simple. Diving, there are some restrictions in terms of the depth, but these animals go beyond the depth of scuba diving, and scuba diving may be forbidden in some countries, while free diving not. But free diving is in shallower areas, and shallower areas, then the juveniles are more exposed. So all those type of arguments, they have to be raised in terms of the evaluation of the impacts of harvesting. And then how that impact, if it's low risk, everything is okay, then it comes to the assessment of the management measures that are being implemented through, for example, quotas in general. Here we are addressing the issue of export quotas, but don't forget what I said before. These export quotas may be a small fraction of the total surplus that is being utilized in the countries, or in some other cases, the export quota is almost over 90% of the total surplus, because the countries are not utilizing the resource historically. If it's low risk, this step in terms of evaluation, then it comes the impacts of trade. And here is then therefore the importance of a stock assessment, etc., and management of gap analysis. We are missing many items, but that doesn't mean that poor conditions in terms of the information does not allow you to build up an NDF. If everything goes perfectly fine with low risks, then you go straight into a final green position that the NDF is not a threat. There is low or minimized risks, and therefore this is an okay in terms of the exporters. However, as you will see tomorrow, there are yellow and orange passes in the sense that not everything is green, not everything is low risk. There are situations where there are very high risks, and therefore this line may not be entirely green, but a mix of green and orange and yellow. And therefore, in the good interpretation on the mix of colors of this line is what the final score is going to be. And therefore, the potential NDF review recommendations by CITES scientific authorities are very fundamental in terms of the government decision in terms of the export. As I said, this is the spinal cord. Tomorrow we will see a much more complex distribution of this trend. But now what is important is to understand that we are asking very valid questions. Even if you don't have any information, statistical information, you may have some qualitative information that may be useful to define the path to yellow or to orange or to green. And the scope of the NDF is then to establish a simplified scoring system. Look at how ambitious. Simplify scoring system when we know that the system is extremely complex, as we will see. And we hope that these NDFs then will serve as a monitoring program for key performance indicators, and this is in the absence of comprehensive statistical stock assessment modeling. Performance indicators are quantifiable metrics used to evaluate negatively correlated risks. What is that negatively correlated risks? If the performance indicator is good, is of a high value, meaning that you have a lot of information and that you're satisfied with the results of your analysis, then the risk is very low. So when performance indicators are high, the risk is low in terms of conservation. The performance indicators are a function of the amount of quality of the information, experience, knowledge available regarding each of the components of the Conch exploited dynamics. And this figure then sort of summarize what I was just saying. When performance indicators are high, the score, then the score for the risk level is very low. And the risk is of a conservation failure. Let us not forget this. The risk refers to the probability of a conservation failure. That is to mean you did not control well your population density and the stock is collapsing because recruitment is getting scarcer and animals are not allowed to grow because exploitation is significant and the larger individuals are being retrieved and some of them are the major contributors to the spawning. But if they cannot encounter each other to mate, then obviously it doesn't matter what that fecundity is when it's not fertilized. And therefore, the core of ecological and biological, etc., conditions and definitions is what follows. And we shall see very quickly, we are going to go back to 5.1 in a few minutes. For example, life cycle characteristics and limited migrations define population range and site fidelity. Site fidelity, on the other hand, has to do with the plasticity of the shell growth. These animals, these shells grow very differently in the different regions. When you see a conch, don't believe that this is equal to the conch in other places in the Caribbean. And the reproductive dynamics, we already mentioned this, has to do with spatial reproduction aggregations and the character of fisheries and statistical validity of the fisheries data used for stock assessment is a big headache we have, and we shall see what those headaches are. Surplus biomass production, that is necessary to understand what you can use from the resource, is obviously related to the LE recruitment effect and the direct abundance and population size structure assessment for adaptive management. What Karen was mentioning with adaptive management, in repeating the exercise, imagine here what you're doing every so many years is you are adjusting your bolt in terms of new knowledge or missing knowledge. In many countries, for example, they have enjoyed a very nice, good statistical system, but all the time, because of economics, because these things are expensive, all the time you have fewer data points from fewer places in the region, etc. So the quality of the data may suffer changes through the history of the fishery, and therefore there is a need to readjust not only the analysis, but also the conservation measures and obviously the enforcement. So quickly, let us review the basic life cycle of these animals. And let us start at the bottom here, where mating occurs of the larger animals. And these animals may even mate above here too. There is a mix here. And then spawning egg masses in the area. And for this purpose, there is a very extensive literature, interesting literature on the ecology of the different regions and how the local ecology plays a role in terms of the spawning success, let us put it. The embryonic development goes through different stages until it goes pelagic, and the veliger then start being distributed by ocean currents, and it goes up to more than a month or so. And here we need to pay attention that the Caribbean has extraordinarily complex ocean currents. In some areas of, for example, just to say an example, in Nicaragua, the currents are going east, but in Belize, they are going north. And if we move to the south of Cuba, in Puerto Rico, etc., they are going west, etc. So there are many ways of meanders that are circulating in the Caribbean that are very much complex by air circulation, the hurricanes, the winds, and the trade winds, the permanent trade winds of the Caribbean they go across the Central American isthmus and create upwelling in the Pacific, for example, etc. So what we have here is the opportunity for these larvae or veligers that in 30 days or more, they can really be carried away. And there comes all the studies that are so difficult and that many organizations, institutions, and scientists are trying to elucidate what is the actual connectivity of the different stocks of conch. And when I say stock, I'm referring to the group of spawners that distribute throughout the region. And they are not evenly distributed. There are better areas than others where these animals know the best condition. And obviously, they have different intensities in terms of the contribution of larvae, etc., to the media. Simulation studies, and these are just simulation studies with as real as possible in terms of the physics of the ocean circulations in these areas. But basically, and this is just to explain the importance of this, if the seeding of the ocean currents, CITES is electronic marks in the simulation of the ocean currents, trying to simulate biophysical movements. When it is unexploited, there is plenty of going back and forth of animals recolonizing different regions. However, as exploitation is increased, all the sudden some of these connectivities tend to become weaker and weaker. This is not real data. The only real data in the simulation, obviously, are the ocean currents and the intensity and direction. But it's a very clear example, a very clear effort that we need to pay attention to the level of spawning, because under very strong conditions of hurricanes, for example, like last year, many of the hurricanes turned north almost at 90 degrees, and apparently they were following a direction north of Jamaica, etc. Those conditions were fairly unusual for the previous strong hurricanes of the early 1990s, etc. So again and again, here there are complexities that they have to build up into the NDF concepts in terms of the questions that they are supposed to be asked. In terms of the biology of these animals, the juveniles, for example, in terms of daily movements, the juveniles almost stay there. That is to mean between 3 to 5 meters per day, while adults may migrate 50 to 100 meters per day. Still, these movements limit extremely the home range of the individuals. And the home range of the individuals doesn't mean the home range of the population, because the home range of the population is this value times whatever is the abundance and the distribution of the animals on the shelf, etc. But in general, animals, individuals, they have a very restricted distribution down there. And quite obviously, there is one effect that I would like to indicate here. When they are free swimming in the currents, and all of a sudden there is this metamorphosis and they settle as a post-larvae here, whatever and whichever is the structure and the general ecology of this area where they landed, creates the actual fate of these animals. So the home range defines trophic ecology, and the trophic ecology obviously is related to food predators and symbionts and connections, etc., and the functionality of affecting growth and the reproductive dynamics. So an animal that settles here or 100 miles from here will have different opportunities to grow and different opportunities on how to reproduce. So when we are talking about stocks now in terms of exploitation, a stock in terms of exploitation is that fraction of the stock that we are subjecting to fishing mortality. The subjecting of some animals to fishing mortality in one region, not affecting other regions where these animals are perhaps saved of the exploitation, creates an imbalance in the natural stock, in the sense that if you are retrieving the best reproducers, then probably you are affecting more the stock than when you are not. If we go to site fidelity, these animals land on the bottom there in a given place. Some of them were lucky and they grew fast because there was a lot of quality in the environment, but some of them did not. And this is real data from tagging studies carried out in the region from ages 0 to 3 years of age. At age 3, they stop growing in terms of shell length and they start putting shell weight. And obviously, when you have such a discrepancy in the amount of yield that these animals can produce in different areas depending on the area of recruitment, may bring extraordinary differences. Unfortunately, this figure, we put a color here that is not good. but this growth in weight, in meat weight, all the time become constant, almost constant, and there is new data now that shows that this tends to decrease with age. And it has to do with the growth of the cavity in the shell that becomes narrower and narrower, and therefore the animal doesn't have the same space to grow. But the point here is look at how different an animal from Martinique is from one in Grand Bahamas. You may argue that probably maybe due to differences in exploitation, but these are animals were collected from the fisheries not too long ago. So they were already subjected to exploitation, etc. And this plasticity then has forced the thinking, well, what is the size of first maturity of these animals? And basically, there is an extensive literature now, good literature, and sometimes a little bit complex, on the lip thickness. The lip thickness is what is a variant that is probably a good identifier of the proportion of mature animals. As they mature, they grow the lip, and the lip thickness has to do too with the amount of tissue weight. And here, these nonlinearities, obviously, they have to do, among other things, on the complexities of diverting energy to reproduction rather than growth, etc., etc. But the variance associated to this, in spite of the variance, it shows a very clear trend that something is going on with lip thickness that reduces the tissue weight. And in fact, in the case of Honduras, we collected information in 2011 or so, and some studies were done for us in terms of the volume of the shell and the volume of the cavity of the shell. And obviously, the cavity of the shell kind of stay rather asymptotic in spite of the growth of the volume of the shell. And that is what creates, obviously, the differences in size at age or at meat size. On the other hand, the lip thickness has to do with the gonad mass relative to body mass, the GSI, and obviously this has to do with the ability, as these animals become more mature, on how then the GSI is changing. So the question now is, through exploitation, by eliminating some of these animals, what is happening with this ratio here? And how much is being impacted by the fact that you are overexploiting these animals? And this is a picture that Monica Valle took several years ago in a given country. And if you look at this pile, this midden, you will be surprised to see that most of them are juveniles. They have not developed the lip. That is to mean that in different piles throughout the Caribbean, there is an opportunity to have a pretty clear idea on the percentage of juveniles that have been caught historically. In fact, in Los Roques in Venezuela, there are some of these middens that are going back to 1630 something, etc. And we did an analysis, for example, of mortality rates then and now. And it's interesting that the exploitation then was very intensive. And we need to remember that the conchs were a very significant source of protein to the Caribs in general, and etc. So this animal has an historic background that goes all the way back many hundreds of years based on the collection of shells that we have all around. Going back then to the reproductive issue here, reproduction is internal, and this then brings the issue of mating success that requires mature densities with a spatial frame that facilitates adequate mobility rates. And here comes the importance of home range conservation, the closed areas, open areas, etc., seasonal closures, etc., etc. So there is an entire, and it is with capital letters because there is an entire chapter on how to protect animals that require a more sensible exploitation, say, at the time of peak reproduction. And here, for example, you have the the way the adult stocks are in different islands. This example is coming from Bowman et al., etc. And we see that there are some areas that are protected by the islands from currents, probably avoiding advection of the larvae, etc. So what we are trying to say with these pictures, and we have pictures like this from many areas in the region. So again, we are not installing here these results for discussing the results, but rather to show that in the region there are many publications with excellent data that tells us about that these animals are not even evenly distributed. Therefore, the protection of some areas, what we are saying here, the importance of home range conservation may play a role, especially at the peak of the spawning seasons. In the case of Pedro Bank, for example, you have the distribution through direct surveys, the juveniles and the adult distributions. The adults are in these areas, the juveniles are in these areas, but not at the level that are found in these particular areas that are obviously these animals have a preference for their own distribution. And there is a spatial probability of reproduction here. So these are the best areas to reproduce, given that the currents are moving this way. It's not a bad idea to spawn here and distribute your larvae in this direction, etc. This has to be modeled somehow, but in order to model all of these, very precise data is required for some of the basic assumptions of the models. Remember that an assumption on a given model is the rules under which the model is valid. And therefore, if our assumptions are wrong, well, the model is going to produce things that are not valid. And that is a question that has to go into the scoring system. You see, if you have this data or you don't have this data, etc. And here we have from a study done by Alex not too long ago in Belize, where you have the conch density in exploited areas and unexploited areas or reserve areas, whichever the name for this. But this clearly shows the value of strategic conservation. And obviously, when you are developing NDFs, it will be nice to have the level of risk of conservation being moderated by the number of reserve areas or protected areas that your country may have, etc. And please realize that a closed area doesn't mean that has to be permanently closed, but perhaps during the spawning season or mating season, probably strategically, it wouldn't be a bad idea to close that area intermittently, let us say, de forma tal de at least allow some of the animals to escape exploitation, etc. And ladies and gentlemen, it's time for a break. So let us say take 10 minutes and continue with this. In the second part, we will discuss the fisheries and what has to be brought out of the fisheries in terms of information that is valid for NDF definitions of the scores. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nelson. So it's 11:45 Eastern. So we will resume at 11:55 promptly. Thank you, everyone. Before we get started, for anyone that might have joined late, interpretation is available in English and Spanish. So you can use the bottom ribbon on your Zoom panel, and you'll see that there is an icon that looks like a world. There you can select either English or Spanish to listen to. We encourage everyone to use the Q&A box to post questions to our presenters throughout the workshop. We will try to answer some of these live, but we do recognize due to limitation in time that we might not be able to. However, we will collate all questions and develop a document at the end. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. I see Julian from Honduras has a question. Please, you can use the chat box to write your questions. So over to you, Nelson, to continue.
All right. Thank you so much. Can you see well now?
Yes, Nelson, we can see your screen.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, let's talk about the fisheries and the statistical validity of the fisheries data that are required for the assessments of risks, etc. First of all, we should distinguish here artisanal Queen Conch fisheries and the movement of artisanal, the transfer of artisanal products into different islands, etc., and the industrials. So first of all, there is plenty of these pictures that are truly extraordinary throughout the Caribbean, from extremely old, from fairly new, etc. This is telling us the importance of the resource and how these animals then have been exploited in the different areas for human consumption. And here we have, in this particular case, in the Bahamas, the transfer.
20,000. You look like more than 20,000. Doug, Doug, Doug. How much you think this one this is? How much you think this is? It's more than 20,000? 5,000. Connie. 40,000. All right.
So there you can see boats are coming to deliver product, and each of the piles appear to be one delivery. But look at the lack of accuracy, or how low precision is in the estimates of what is going on. What about 20,000? No, it's 35. No, it's 40. The differences is huge, and the number of animals is incredibly high. Now, the problem with these particular statistics on landings from artisanal fisheries is the origin, first of all. That is to mean defining fishing grounds. And as we saw already on the Pedro Bank surveys, these animals are not evenly distributed. So you may be exerting an excess of exploitation in a given area that is ideal for reproductive purposes, and impacting the stock very differently, in the belief that your cache data will represent the surplus for the entire population, when in fact is for a given fraction of the population. And the transfer of product from one island to another, if there is no official statistical system in place that takes care of this transfer, makes the data from landings extremely statistically biased, I will say, in terms of the stocks, identification of the origin within the island chain in the Bahamas, in this case, for example. And this is only one example. And obviously, tourism requires conch and conch is an important item in the menus. And therefore, imports not only from within the country but from outside of the country are also occurring. And therefore, there is a need to understand what is the mix of this. Since we cannot count all what is going on here, we say that artisanal statistical data on catch and fishing effort must be estimated necessarily. Okay, and in order to estimate this, then we need to establish a sampling experimental design that should include a primary census of fishing units in coastal areas, and then a secondary fishing survey of few randomly selected primary units where you establish then the number of animals that were landed and found in the samples, and then use the information from the surveys to be expanded to total using the census data. And for this purpose, I truly recommend that you read this report that we did for Jamaica, which is an extraordinary example on how to implement this situation with the artisanal fisheries. And it can be done, and it must be done if an NDF is going to have any value in terms of what we know of the exploitation of the resources. The industrial fisheries, and this is coming out of our own research in Honduras, which had a very significant major research program in the entire region, and that I think is still going on today, which is good. The situation here is different in the sense that the dinghies go in the water, this is the mother ship, and they go fishing, and they come back with products semi-clean on board of the mother ship, and then they continue cleaning this to at least 85 to 95% of the catch, and then is packed into those bags and then brought to the processing plant. Here there is a census in the sense of the animals when they come on board, these guys have to be paid, etc., according to their catch, and the captain obviously need to know exactly what is he catching in the several days, several 2 weeks trips, etc., where they are collecting, working hard on board, etc., and there is an accounting in place that is corroborated at the end in terms of the landings. So landings under significant control of product owners and processing plants is going on. Landings follow a census characteristic. Landings from different fishing grounds are mixed and initially processed on board. And more importantly, all these vessels will have satellite tracking devices that are used to provide very important data on estimating landings by fishing ground and especially fishing intensity. That is the amount of fishing effort that is deployed per unit of area. And since conch stock management must be some sort of a spatially directed process, it is very important that the fishery statistics are also spatially processed. So you have a link between the sources that create mortality and the stock that is being affected by that mortality. If the catch and effort data does not bring that information, then how can you draw any information about the stocks? It's as simple as that. So that is to mean you may collect data, but it's statistically data poor in terms of truly reflecting the status of the different stocks. In the case of Jamaica, very quickly, there are inshore, inland shelf fisheries that are basically artisanal. However, there is some artisanal activity in the offshore banks, petrobanks basically, where the industrial vessels mostly operate. And what is important about this flow chart, and it is in the study, here is the authorship, and you're going to have the reference, and this study is going to be put in the list of important references. You have the points where sampling should take place, you see. The industrial sites, you have the census data coming this way, and then you can corroborate the origin of this. Artisanal boats, product transfer, you saw the video there, and unfortunately there is no place to sample here because you saw there, which is roughly impossible to sample there. But that product will arrive in industrial sites, and the artisanal sites obviously go to retail. When we carry out this study in Jamaica, we did a fairly good review of what is a situation like this in different countries with their different fishing grounds, and how the industrial fisheries or artisanal fisheries behave in terms of producing data. The methodology in the Jamaica study is fairly simple, if you wish, given the complexity of this. First of all, you need to have a census of the number of boats and the number of fishing trips that they carry out on average by asking the question to fishers. And therefore, you know more or less by locality what is the number of boats and how many fishing trips they carry out, etc. And then you select a few of these groups of fishers in the census, and you carry out a survey of their landings. And here you select random selection, for example, of 5 localities in the case of Jamaica, and then a random selection of a few boats, intercept them and collect the percentage of clean meat levels by day fishing, by selected boats, etc. And then you, with this data, can estimate these fractions. These are very simple estimations to estimate fishing days, total fishing days, and the total fishing days are multipliers of the average landing per fishing day coming from this numeral, and you have the total landings per week because the sampling was done on a weekly basis. Okay, so the architecture, the statistical design of this is pretty simple, but it's rigorous in terms of you need to go and sample. And fortunately, and we have beautiful pictures in this report of the ladies that went there and did a very, very fine job of collecting this information. It's doable. Obviously depends also for other cases, other islands, in the number of persons that you may have. In the smaller islands, probably are less requirement. Jamaica is an important island because it has Petrobank in front. That is a major conch producing area, and therefore you could expect significant landings. When we go to the results of the Jamaica surveys, those localities along the coast of the island produce a fairly significant amount, 4,226 kilograms in 1 week. That is to mean almost 17,000 kilos in a month. And what is even more significant is how close the confidence interval is. That is to mean that the interviews went well. They were not disparate numbers, and they are very narrow confidence intervals. What was surprising is that the artisanal fishers from Rocky Point that go to fish in Petrobank, they collect a very significant amount of conch per week, 14,000 kilograms per week. That is to mean almost 50,000 kilograms per month. that is a very significant amount of conch, probably more than what is being done in many countries. But the point is that a simple, well-defined, well-thought experimental sampling design generate results that are very important for the NDF. Even if you don't have or you have not done this before, you have the chance to consult with Jamaica. Jamaica is open to this, and they have the experience and they know how to do these things. And therefore, there is a community in the region that can contribute to better statistics for the rest of the region. Obviously, each country will have their own needs and et cetera, et cetera. But please realize that the efforts throughout the region, there are countries that they have very good descriptions of their fisheries. They may not have annual surveys of their landings, but they do have surveys done not yearly, but every other year or so. So there are indications of what the level of landings are, and especially the kind of product that is being generated. Not all that product will go to exports, and therefore there is a difference. In the case of Jamaica, for example, the industrial fishery, the one producing the most biomass, let us say, the mother ship and the small boats, divers, etc., they receive, etc. They do all the process, and then there is a service by veterinary services, etc., as well as the National Environment Authority, etc., because there is an export to the European countries, and there are very strict conditions that the product that is coming from this bank goes to export to very highly required conditions, and they have to comply with those. Therefore, compliance is directly associated with better data. As you saw, there is a census of all this data, so the level of accuracy is very important. The sources for this are from Conch 21 and then Prada and Appledon, and there is a new one that is in the report of the Jamaica survey. So here you can see that some countries have very complex conch fisheries, from a combination of national artisanal to artisanal fishers that are fishing all the way in the offshore banks, and their catches are being implemented or integrated, better said, to the exports, and therefore subjected to more significant review of the quality and origin, etc., etc. So one other important point here is that in all these fisheries, you have very different products. In some of them, dirty or 65% clean, 85% clean, or 100% clean. So the conch reduces in size, obviously, for the quality of the meat that is being offered by demand. In some countries, especially those countries with industrial fisheries, a 65 to 85% clean meat is the one being landed, as to avoid the labor on land to bring from dirty weight to clean weight, etc. Especially the conservation and the quality of the product, if you don't clean it on board, will suffer significantly. So all this story is to tell that you need sort of conversion factors for these different types of products. And it has to come from samples of whole animals. That is to mean a conversion factor. You have an animal in the shell that you should subject to the cleaning by those that are professionally cleaning. In my personal experience, I have a couple of cases where some biologists did this work, And the conversion factors were quite wrong, I have to say, because they were not at the professional level that is being done by those that are in the commerce of queen conch meats. So you need to extract from the total landings with a given percentage weight samples that are entire individuals to obtain these values of conversion factors, and then you have a table of conversion factors, and the total landings then reported by the different conditions, different stratifications in purely statistical language. The different stratifications of the meat then has to be transformed into total dirty meat weight, or live weight, which is what the FAO requires for their national statistics. In the region, for over 10 or 12 years, there was a major effort trying to develop and improving these conversion factors. And I believe that we do have an extraordinary good and strong database to play some analysis in terms of differences, stratifications, days, depth, etc. And especially animals within a country but from different regions may have different conversion factors because of the local ecology where these animals are attached to since they settle in those areas. So there is plenty of this information, and there is a report that is an FAO report, I think, in 2019 that brings some statistical analysis that will facilitate the collection of data and use some very simple, basic linear regressions to estimate these conversion factors with a given variance. The importance of variance here is very significant in the sense that gives you a level of risk of misestimating or wrongly estimating the landings or producing landings with a very large variance. Let us move now to the actual stock assessment. Traditionally, surplus biomass production models have been used for so many different fisheries, and they have been applied to the conch in Belize. However, there is a very significant study by Esquivel, a PhD dissertation on this with strong simulation models on this. And the problem is that the logistic function that is being used in these models, obviously the logistic surplus production model can be of very many different types. This is for simplicity and the time we have here, but you may have even non-equilibrium type of situations here, but the amount of data that you need is almost impossible considering the type of data that we have available. This type of models will estimate the asymptotic biomass, that is to mean the maximum biomass of the stock, the biomass by years, which then generates the form of this, and then the fishing mortality according to the years, and most importantly, the maximum sustainable yield and the fishing mortality that generate that maximum sustainable yield. With this information, then, we can make an assessment of what the status of present-day fisheries are, in the sense of at a given year, you have a given level of biomass and a given level of fishing effort, but you can compare those values with those that belong to the maximum sustainable yield. And based on that, then you can estimate some sort of a trend of the biomass at any given time divided by the biomass at maximum sustainable yield in the x-axis against the ratio of the fishing mortality in a given year with respect to the fishing mortality estimated by the model corresponding to the maximum sustainable yield. So when you are here in 1-1, you are exactly fishing at maximum sustainable yield. And it allows you to plot the trend, how a given population was exploited. And obviously, there are differences of being here in these different quadrats. And that is what this famous interpretation is an example of normalized interpretation. Normalized is when you are referring to an average or a given level. And then you have when the stock is in this area with this level here, for example, corresponding to this, it is a level of safe exploitation. On the other hand, if your present day biomass divided by the biomass at maximum sustainable yield is over here, and your fishing mortality is way over the fishing mortality at maximum sustainable yield, then you are in the overfishing and overexploitation situation. Okay, so clearly you are right here. On the other hand, you can be in the situation of overfishing or overfished, and these are very confusing terms in the sense that you have overfishing when your biomass is high at time t relative to the biomass at maximum sustainable yield, but however, your fishing mortality is way above the fishing mortality that should exist at maximum sustainable yield. And then, on the contrary, overfished is when your biomass is well below the maximum and etc. The fishing mortality is well below the maximum too. So this situation here then is applied for the logistic model that we explained here, the simple surplus production model for simplicity. There are, as I said, dynamic models. The priors of the model can help in the introduction of probability and assumptions related to the LE effect. In the work with Valle in 2008, we have from the simulations, if you apply just the logistic model for fish to Conch, it goes this way. But if you apply some sort of a density dependence of recruitment into the production model, it happens that the maximum sustainable yield is lower at a much lower level of fishing effort. Okay, so that is to mean, and please note that while this is parabolic, it's the same shape all around, this is parabolic up to here and then it collapses. In the case of the study in Belize, for example, the plot of biomass, population biomass in the last few years collapses significantly. I mean, not collapses, it drops significantly. The meaning of this compared with the previous years when it was in this area here creates a suspicion that probably the model that was used may not be reflecting the Ali effect. And that is important. And I will say that the results of Belize are that the stocks are in the red. That is to mean some sort here. However, it has a huge variance. Meaning the uncertainty of the parameters should be taken into account. But just talking with the other two consultants when we were developing this, we believe that the situation, if it's this and not that, then the situation seen in Belize may be optimistic relative to what in reality may be happening. And this is a speculation out of just purely looking at things, but the purpose here is not do the research and question the research, but rather say there is a lot of research going on, and the NDFs should take into account the different results from different sorts of lines, etc., of research, and especially of the data that were used in order to do this research. So the production function refer to density-dependent recruitment. The maximum, I already said that, the maximum sustainable yield is lower than the maximum sustainable yield when the logistic model is used. The surplus production is not parabolic, but it's distorted to the right, descending much faster in the right limb. And the increasing fishing effort beyond maximum sustainable yield in this area here generate stock collapse due to failures in mating affecting recruitment, which is not common in any of the fish stocks that these production models are used. I understand and I know that some new developments in new types of production models can be implemented and probably suggested in the NDF discussions for Conch. However, the data requirements and the requirements of the data, which are two different things here, statistically speaking, may mean that much sophisticated data, spatially, temporally, have to be collected by the different stratifications that we see in terms of artisanal fisheries and industrial fisheries, etc. And in all of this, we are not considering the illegal transshipment of products throughout the Caribbean that exist. I know that some countries control some of that, but it's something that is going on. Is the exports of conch to islands with high tourism probably do not have the level of human resources to collect data, which is a big problem. And that brings us into a very touchy subject matter in that the countries sometimes don't have an opportunity to obtain a rent, let us say, in their own resources. And this may be the case when exportations, etc., are, etc., etc. But in terms of NDFs, given the economic value of this resource, should be of consideration the need to score the level of how to say this, the level of participation of the statistical departments of the countries in terms of producing the fine database that should be required under ideal conditions. Again and again, remember, NDFs is a scoring system based on qualitative and quantitative data, and your country may vary within one extreme to the other in between the qualitative and the quantitative. But the important thing is that you are aware of what the condition is, or the conditions are, because there are quite a few of them, and generate the scoring. And the scoring will catapult ideas and interest in improving or in controlling what is good and investing in what is not so good, etc. So it allows the fine-tuning of the stock assessment process. So after all of this, what we have talked about, I'm checking on my time here. Yeah, we are okay. In terms of the recommendations, let us say, well, what do I do? What do I do if I don't have data and the data I have is not good for applying any of the statistical models to assess the fishery? We believe that direct surveys are truly the way out here, because the direct surveys produce an incredibly an incredible opportunity to generate all sorts of data, spatially assigned. That is to mean it allows you to collect information that is more than sufficient for completing your NDFs. So let us start with a very, very simple figure that is in some of our works and etc. on Conch. What is accuracy and what is precision? For example, here, this is the actual true population, let us say. Let us assume that this is the distribution of weights of flesh conch landed, the average weight. That all the time I take a sample that is not correctly stratified, and I get a value that is here, which is very far from here. So this has a lack of accuracy, but it has a very high precision. That is to mean the variance is very good. While another sample is very accurate because it's close to the real thing, but has a very low precision, and because of the variance. The way we sample, the experimental sample designs that we recommend for this, which are in the manuals that we have developed, are telling you that a good sampling, experimental sampling design that allows you the spatial express the spatial distribution of the conch is one that is systematic. Systematic sampling design are lacking the randomness that other sampling designs will have, but however, it allows you mapping, and mapping is absolutely important here. And then within each of these sample sites, you can distribute at random diving stations. And that is exactly what we did in Honduras and now part of Nicaragua, etc., in the early 2000s. And with this, then, you obtain very good statistics on the size frequencies, male, females, spawning, non-spawning, etc., the maturity stages by depth and by regions that allow you then, based on the sampling, these are the sampling stations, allows you to estimate the actual standing stock. What is standing stock? And standing stock here, which is important for NDF, is the amount of biomass that you encounter at a given time in a given place, and is not related to the annual population biomass. So there is a need to understand the definitions for the data that you are using for producing the different scores. Now, the sampling, direct sampling, there are plenty of this, and we have a couple of manuals on this. The basic idea here for shallow areas is this. For deeper areas, we have all kinds of instruments. Some of them, lately in some of the islands, they develop a device mounted on PVC, and it worked perfectly well to estimate the number of conchs per unit of area. The per unit of area is the most important variable to be measured absolutely correctly, because it's a multiplier, it's an expansion factor. And therefore, if you do not know exactly how to do this underneath here, or when you are being towed by a boat or swimming, etc., or towing here, there are all kinds of laser pointers attached to this, so you know exactly the width of the path, and the length of the path is the time that you sail in here, etc. So the area can be estimated with high precision. And if you have two divers operating here, you are going to have a variance, etc. So you have the numbers of animals that you find within your standardized swept area by the divers. This then will generate the numbers per unit of area. And this is, as an example, what we did in Honduras in the different fishing grounds. Now, geopolitically, the boundary changed, and now some of the banks here are now shared by the two countries. And the purpose of putting this and making the comment is that if a given country has shared resources and they are applying this technique, they better get a conversation on standardizing the methodology of the two countries so they can add or integrate, better said, the results of surveys done in one country and the other. So they have an entire idea of what is the actual biomass, population biomass, and all the biological characteristics that you can draw from these surveys that are so important. Here, out of the very extensive, incredible work of Dr. Stoner in the Bahamas for so many years, it's interesting to see, for example, the density of mature conch versus fishing pressure. And this fishing pressure has a very unique definition in terms of depending how close you are to big cities, is what I'm trying to say. Quite obviously, if you are very close to where the demand is, you're obviously more subjected to be overexploited. And each of these points is obviously related to situations where different levels of exploitation create exactly what we're talking about, the density of the mature conch, not of all the conchs, but how in certain areas the fishing pressure brought this down, and is obviously the best food for the Ali effect. In the case of the data we collected in Oneida and Gorda in Honduras, we saw the same thing, as we were able to estimate an index of total mortality from the weight frequency analysis that we carried out. And we see that in the banks there is a decline in the density of the entire population. This is the mature. We never found juveniles in the offshore areas, and you see this decline that is telling you be careful, because you are going down. Ideal is to see this going kind of, it doesn't matter the level, if it's above this level, but it goes in this way and not in this way. So diving surveys, Jamaica has a history of this, of replicate petrobank surveys every other few years, and then they have the great opportunity of seeing how biomasses are changing spatially on the bank throughout the years. And there might be related to different levels of recruitment in the areas, given that Petrobank is in the middle of the path of the Caribbean current, and the Caribbean current is so much affected by hurricane season, etc., right at the time when these animals are spawning, etc. So look at what I'm saying here. There is so much information, plenty of information, that could be exquisite from a quantitative standpoint and could be exquisite from the qualitative standpoint. And in both cases, they contribute to the construction of the score system. So the important information generated by the direct survey approach to assess the Queen Conch resources and generate fishing controls. First of all, a systematic replicated experimental sampling designed to estimate population habitat range and fishing ground mapping. Secondly, fishing density and size sex structures in the distribution of the survey area. Site fidelity regarding growth, mating success, and spawning. Overall population mortality rate and population abundance. While from commercial population density surveys, Please realize that the surveys we did in Honduras were commercially driven. That is to mean in the first few days of the fishing trip, each captain in each of the boats, four boats, vessels, they visited very specific sampling sites, and all the divers will jump and collect the data we needed, etc. And with that, once the sampling stations were covered, they could go anywhere they wanted to fish. And the biologists on board, obviously, they have a huge amount of work in the sense that they have to separate and collect the proper data at the proper time, and the huge conditions of crowdiness on board of the vessels, etc. But it can be done, which is important. And what is more important is that it was done and is still being done. So is something that we need to be aware. The fraction of the habitat range used by commercial exploitation. This is very important as compared to the population habitat range. That is to mean the survey can carry out the survey and look at the entire population, while here you see what fraction of that population is the one that is commercially exploited. The population density on fishing grounds, that is telling you if this population was mature, if they were spawning or not, were mating or not, etc. The exploited population mortality rate and the abundance of the stock can be estimated from these commercial surveys. So once you have catch and effort under control, statistically speaking, then you could apply some of the biological knowledge that you get from these surveys to have two very important things. That is to mean the trajectory in cash per unit of effort, a cash per unit of effort that you believe that is credible, statistically speaking, because the quality of your data covers all the stratifications of the stock. And the stratification of the stock is known because you carry out surveys, and the surveys are telling you where these animals are more or less distributed. And if you have information on the ecology of the ocean bottom there, you will have reasons to justify the presence or not justify the absence of animals in given areas. And that gives you the ability to deal with something that is very much deserved by this resource that is so unique, socially and economically important by all the nations in the Caribbean. We're coming to the end, and here we have some summaries that are a little bit difficult to make an interpretation of. It's something that is coming out of a work by one of the consultants in 2019, as we say here, Alex. And just in conversations while we were preparing this, the information that was available in this publication, we thought, and he expanded it to a third axis, which is density. When you create a new axis here, this is three-dimensional then, you create an incredible set of opportunities to think in terms of what is inside of each one of these cubes. So let us start with juveniles. This is the pre-capture animals, okay? And this is the actual size of the animals, okay? So it indirectly is a measure of age. So when the size of these animals is very small and the density is small, then there is a very low recruitment of larval supply, because these animals, by being smaller, their fecundity is not as high as those animals that are mature and reproducing, like here. And on the other hand, these juveniles may be having a very high density and larger individuals in the pre-capture situation. And these animals are in the green in the sense that they are contributing significantly to the larval supply. So this corner here is the larval supply by different groups under different density conditions, you see. Therefore, within each one of these blocks or cubes, there is an entire population dynamics in time and space that is going on. Only a correct sampling design will allow us to allocate a little bit of sampling effort to each one of these cubes and see what is the dynamics of density, size, and recruitment. And please remember, recruitment will be in the form of larval supply that requires a different way to assess them, etc. But once recruitment is estimated, the adult recruitment, when these larval stages become adult recruited to the fishery, then you have the issue of the age or size at first capture that is being driven, should be driven by the size of first maturity, that in the case of the conch is the lip thickness, and then the amount of fishing effort. So if the animals are big in size and fishing effort is low, you are in the happy triangle here. But that triangle may change to being moderate, caution, or in the case of extreme effort and the age of first capture is very low because the older animals disappear already because of fishing, then you are in the red here. So this is one way that complex science can be transformed into an interpretation by exploitation. And then you should move the spawner recruitment relationship. That is to mean, what is the true relationship of recruitment, future recruitment for this, but of the adult fish, of the adult conch. And the same here, you have the size of the animals, the mega spawners, and the density of them. If the density is low and the size is small, you will have necessarily a total fecundity that is prone to fail, and therefore creating the Ali effect. And then it moves into this under a very low recruitment, you see, etc. So each one of these cubes, this cube and this cube don't have anything to do in common, but there are dynamic conditions going on there that are being affected by so many other elements, like the environment, the catastrophic environmental events. I'm referring to hurricanes and rain, etc., that in some cases affect, in some other cases do not affect the shallow areas of the islands. But if you are along the Yucatan Peninsula, for example, with torrential rains, obviously the runoff affects the lagoons, the coastal lagoons, and the runoff into other areas, etc. Perhaps it will be difficult to define a score for NDF for environmental conditions, but there is a risk, especially with major hurricanes that we are observing in the later years, and even the frequency of hurricanes in the later years have intensified significantly. Then the scoring becomes important. And although you don't have the exact quantitative impact, you may have some sort of a qualitative idea of what may mean a series of hurricanes that you have seen your catch rates the next year or the following year to have decreased, for example. etc. So these type of interpretations, I think, are very important, and obviously they allow us to sort of think in terms of what is surplus yield here when you have so many variables that your country wishes to use the resource for your own benefit, and whatever is left over from the local use of the surplus that could be exported, then you have enough support to secure the fact that you are exporting under knowledge that the situation with your stock is safe in the sense of low risk. So finally, we're coming here to the adaptive management. You assess the fishery exploitation via direct surveys and trends in CPUE and landings, and you need to adapt management regulations. And after 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, whatever number of years, you do the next assessment, and you have a chance to once again adapt the regulations, etc., and go like this through time. The question here is the cost of all of this. The expertise, I think the region has an extraordinary expertise on most of these things. The question is how to allocate this in time that gives the adaptive management regulations to be more effective. Okay, so effective adaptive fisheries management requires accurate estimate of stock biomass and trends. However, the assumptions of direct stock assessment models generate high levels of uncertainty and error if sampling experimental designs do not reflect the exploited population dynamics of the species. What I'm trying to say here is that if you are planning to do a survey in a given area, but you're not covering the extent of the population area, let us say, or the stock area that you're interested in, then it's meaningless. And it can be even misleading in the fact that you may be assessing a very healthy corner of the population while the rest of the population is being heavily exploited. So all these matters are really important. And what is the summary then of what we have talked up to now in support of the arguments for developing the scores in tomorrow is, first of all, the slow mobility resulting in restricted spatial migrations, limiting habitat range, and the phenotypic differences in growth, and also the reproductive dynamic success limited by mating success limited by mature population densities. And here we need to pay attention to the mature population density, because otherwise you may be counting immature individuals that are not reproducing, etc., in your estimates of biomass. The fractions of this reproductive population density are spatially stratified, and we need to understand what those stratifications are relative to the stratifications of the fishing operations. So you can estimate how many times, for example, the fishing operations during a given fishing season is targeting the reproductive stock and when it's not. And it has to do with the catchability coefficient. The catchability coefficient is the fraction of the stock that you catch per unit of fishing effort. And therefore, when you cannot estimate this Q value, is one of the most difficult parameters to be estimated in stock assessment. However, the new advanced models, they have the ability to probabilistically estimate these Q values, the catchability coefficients. And in order to have the proper estimate, you need to have a better understanding on how spatially distributed components of the reproductive population are being affected by the fisheries. The individual biomass growth is limited by shell morphology at age, which is severely impacting population biomass at age. Therefore, yield changes dramatically not on a von Bertalanffy type of growth, but rather in something that is more a negative logistic type of approach. And obviously, there must be an optimum, ideally, an optimum population size or age structure that generate the best levels of biomass that can be exploited for a given level of yield. Then the population production functions for Queen Conch, the production functions are the ones that are moving the moles, let us say, and they have the intrinsic parameters that generate all the knowledge that we need, are very complex, and due to the insufficient understanding of reproductive density dependence effects on recruitment, we are still, in spite of all the years of research, we are still at the very early stages of understanding the impact of density dependence on surplus yield. It's not a simple spawning recruit relationship like in fishes, let us say. Although I have to say that in free swimming species, fish species, spawning recruit relationship, they have a huge variance for very many unknown situations that are related to the sequence of mortality at different stages of eggs and larvae, etc., etc. In the case of conch, it's much more difficult from the very beginning. That is to mean from the time that mating was a failure. If mating is a failure, then everything else is a failure. The effects of uneven spatial exploitation effects of mating success prevent the use of traditional stock assessment models used for fish species. There are some models that will allow to draw some conclusions, but it's better to have simpler models that are statistically robust, I would say, that countries could implement with the means and ways that are available to the countries and the investments that are needed. Missing population abundance and fishery exploitation estimate compromise the statistical validity of annual sustainable catch quotas. And these are not the export quotas. This is the total allowable catch biologically justified in this particular case, part of which will stay in the country, part of which is going to be exported. And finally, the stock assessment data assumptions and their statistical validity affected by spatial exploitation patterns of diverse fishing fleet operation compromise accuracy as well as precision of population abundance estimates. This is just to call the attention that the different fleets, the different fisheries actually, artisanal or industrial, etc., will create impacts which are very different from very different components of the populations of conch in the region. The next step then is the NDF implementation and scoring that is coming tomorrow, but this is the model. So what you saw here, we talk about this. The definition of going this way or that way is what Rich is gonna do tomorrow for each one of these steps. And here is where you need most of the reasoning and the conceptual understanding and framing of what we spoke so quickly and compressed this morning. I would like to say that this is a tool, like Karen was saying, that it could be extremely useful into the future because this is an X-ray of what is happening with the different populations of conch, being affected by the different fisheries, by different supply and demand, and especially by conditions in gap management analysis that we're still missing so many different things that probably could be integrated into the general gap analysis. So that's all what I have to say for today, and I hope I was able to accomplish the idea of providing some general understandings of things that we know, but we have never integrated regionally in molds like the ones that you have in the screen right now. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Nelson. I'm just going to stop your screen share for now and invite Rich, Alex, and Karen to come back on screen. We do have time for questions, and there are a few in the chat that we can address first, and then that can open the floor for more questions. We do have some questions that have already been answered via text. So if needed, we can always add more detail if needed. We do have some question from Stephen Dipmore, who is interested in how currents affect Grenada, which he believes is upstream of other islands. And he's asking about data on this, and also if there is room for creativity in how experiments in fisheries management or enforcement are undertaken and financed, and how might collaboration among the OECS states be encouraged. So I'm not sure if anyone specifically wants to answer this question, if at all.
Well, it's a good question. Thank you so much. Grenada is in such a geographical position there, which is unique in that sense. The question comes to my mind is the problem of the transfer of product, coming from different islands close by, where the resource is getting scarcer. So the question is, what the demand is in one island, how does it affect the supply from other islands, given that the resources must be managed somehow? And I remember when we were there, one of the main concerns were basically how to carry out this type of surveys in a quick, inexpensive way. And in some of the neighboring islands, they did that. And islands where they constructed these PVC type of towed platforms where they put some video cameras, which are very inexpensive these days. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, but the opportunity is there to do some research. And obviously, the problem on the accuracy of landings is an issue that needs to be considered.
Thank you, Nelson. There are a couple more comments/questions from Stephen. One was related to industrial fishing, and does industrial exclusively harvest in deep water? And then also with the aspects related to maturity, or when they move to deep water, and at what point in their lifespan are they most productive?
I have my co-author Alex and Rich experts on that topic, so probably they can answer. I can drink some water.
So yeah, regards the adult, I mean, we mostly see them moving towards deeper water as they age, but as we illustrated in the life history, spatial life history, adults will move to shallower water during reproductive periods. So they are more vulnerable to both artisanal free divers and tank divers or hookah divers or whatever you have going on. So this overlapping components of the life history is problematic when you try to protect certain aspects with spatial closures. So that has to be considered, that these animals are intermixing even with age over certain periods. I think the question that came up earlier that might speak to some of this sort of regional, if we could consider regional management or considering your neighbors in managing your stock, is this whole metapopulation idea. We saw a couple of figures that are based on, and again, that is not an expertise I have, but it is based on a paper that I shared, which we will make available, Vaz et al. 2022. This is based on the understanding of larval dispersal time, the understanding of oceanographic currents, which are from satellite data, oceanographic buoys that collect data on current direction and speed, the understanding that we have of the presence of spawning adults in different jurisdictions, and the understanding that a conch veliger larvae only has a certain time to get to a suitable habitat, which is shallow water. So many of them will die in the ocean or be eaten by pelagic or planktonic predators. But our emphasis in the NDF guidance and a principle that I've sort of lived by is that local recruitment is the thing you really need to be concerned with. As a manager of a national jurisdiction, your emphasis should be on preserving a large enough adult population that will supply your population into the future, and not depending on the management of conch stocks in a neighboring jurisdiction. That still is something to consider, and that is a collaboration that countries that share a common island shelf, for example, might be collaborative in that way. There's the example of Nicaragua and Honduras that have a border that crosses through fishing grounds that might be affected with this shared resourcing and sharing of recruits to those harvested populations. So a bit of a long-winded argument to that idea that let's not get hung up on the one figure that was presented about the metapopulation dispersal, and that you should concentrate on preserving your local spawning stock and recruitment.
Thank you, Alex. And I would like to encourage all attendees, if you do have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. I also want to bring awareness that Krista Sherman has posted a link to a paper that is titled Exploitation Drives Changes in the Population Connectivity of Queen Conch. So I just want to bring attention to that. One thing that I would like to, because I'm not sure how much the participants have been able to see the questions that have already been answered. I do think that people may be wondering about the concept of eDNA and its ability to estimate trends in population size instead of labor-intensive transect lines, etc. Alex would have already answered this in the chat, but maybe just for the benefit of the wider audience, Alex, could you talk about eDNA and abilities to estimate trends very briefly while we wait for other questions?
Okay, I again, that is not my expertise, but I think the concern that I would have is the resolution of eDNA. I mean, from what I understand, it can give you a good idea of presence or absence of species. It can give you an understanding of the biodiversity of an area, but it will not be able to replace direct contact, even if it's with video of your conch population. You can't get at the size structure. You can't get at this idea of the patchiness that's been discussed this morning quite a bit. So I think, again, if you're really unsure if you have queen conch in your jurisdiction, eDNA might help you there. but I don't think anybody today that's present would have that issue. So again, and I suggested that that might be an interesting line of research to, collaborate or coordinate with eDNA information and direct visual surveys, whether it be hands-on by divers or through video.
You and I see there is a question.
Rich has his hand up.
Oh, go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, so I want to go back a bit. First, on the question of connectivity. The Voss et al. Paper is a simulation study based on the best information they could get. It's a simulation study, so you have to wonder whether the best information is sufficient. One of the things that's come out of that is that if you look at the genetic studies that have been done that suggest where you have subpopulations, those are indicating that that simulation study overestimates connectivity substantially. So this idea that Alex was talking about is you really need to worry about your home population as a source of your recruits is important. And so going back a step further, Stephen was asking about currents and information on that. There is a fair amount of information that's available on currents because of satellite monitoring, basically of dynamic heights of the ocean, which indicate which way the water's flowing. And there are sites, I don't know them off the top of my head, but there are sites in NOAA where these are posted with some frequency so you can see how these change over time. But the fact that, say, Barbados, which is even further upstream, has been able to sustain conch populations indicates that there are probably flowback or eddies and gyres that are develop in response to currents hitting islands and channels. So, and these allow mechanisms for larvae that are spawned to get brought back into those spawning grounds. And again, you look at the historical record of exploitation in both in Grenada and up in the Grenadines and those platforms. It's been going on for very long periods of time. So clearly there are mechanisms there of bringing in that reproductive output back into the system at some level.
Thank you, Rich. Alex?
Yeah, just to add on to that and just reaching to another species that we're all very familiar with here is the Nassau grouper. So earlier work on Nassau grouper thought that they would go to their mass spawning aggregation sites to disperse their larvae as far as possible. But more recent work indicates that they went to those specific sites because of this retraction or grabbing onto those larvae and getting them back to where the adults live. And I think that's the newest thinking, and I think that is probably occurring at a much higher rate for many of these planktonic larvae than previously. Decades ago, we thought that they're just trying to spread themselves as widely as possible. But the adults are there to try to retain their larvae as much as possible on the site that they've been successful at.
Well, the same is true with the spiny lobster, for example, that they have animals that are floating in the ocean for such a long time. And we brought out a paper a few years ago, demonstrating that, for example, the spiny lobster stocks of Florida, their recruitment substantially contribute the local stock. And before, the idea was that most of the larvae were coming from upstream. And another comment that is curious, when you lack information on the oceanography, there are some very simple variables that the data are available. For example, the Caribbean mean sea level is changing, and is changing quite significantly. And besides the usual changes seasonally because of the wind conditions, etc., obviously, if there is a changing pattern yearly changing pattern in the Caribbean sea level, average sea level. It will be interesting how the larval redistribution with sea level plays a role, etc. But for those things, you need to have long-range databases that will be interesting to accumulate, obviously.
And if I could add just a bit for the other CITES sponsored study, it's on the genetics of the conch populations throughout the Caribbean. And the results of that will be, I think, much more relevant to the questions of connectivity or replenishment or retention of larvae than what we're going to find using more generic models.
Thank you, Rich. And one of the question posed in the chat comes from Nigel Gibbs. And he asked, what effect, if any, that high density of megaspawners have on recruitment success?
Alex, you have something on the mega spawners. It is quite obvious that mega spawners are big contributors. However, the question remains in terms of how badly or poorly exploited are those fractions of the stock, and simply we don't have the data. But is mostly comment are out of common sense. But Alex, you have some comments on the mega.
Well, I think I will, and Rich will as well, but I think it comes from this idea. You could also use the term BOF, the big, old, fat, fecund females. This is from the fish literature. And that is to say, with fish, they grow continuously until they die of old age if they're allowed to survive that long. So it's been shown sort of generally that big, old, fat, fecund females or mega spawners have the best eggs. They have the highest survival of their larvae and going into juvenile states. So although that fraction of the population is fairly small, they're very important in the total, when we think about the axis of total fecundity. They contribute disproportionately higher. So preserving some of those and allowing some of them, in our case here, to escape the fishery and be in a place where they can be reproductive and contributing to overall fecundity is critical. So this is the idea of creating a maximum size. And this is much easier for fish and for lobster because they continuously get longer with age. Conch is a little trickier to identify or sort of partition your protection for those, but it could be on lip thickness. You could say with we see very old conchs that could have a 40 millimeter lip thickness. So if you say, don't harvest them over 25 or 30, but again, you start to get the confounding issue of the cavity size getting smaller. So that reduces fecundity with very old age. So again, conch are uniquely complicated. And Rich, you might want to add to that.
I think your comment about uniquely complicated hits it on the head. And there is that question, in the document, we actually give two different views of how you might approach the megaspawner issue. But there isn't a yes or no way to do this. The other would be, don't harvest your really largest adults because at least from a fecundity point of view, they're going to, numbers of eggs, they're going to be the ones that are going to have to be able to do that just because they're going to be larger body size. And as they mature, they should come into this area where they start producing better quality eggs and enhance that fecundity role up until some point where some kind of, the cavity closes and they start perhaps losing the number of eggs they can do, but they can potentially offset that by spawning more frequently or spawning more egg masses because they can spawn multiple egg masses. These are just one of the areas that we just don't have data on. And but we do have data, and Alex has been one of the best to show this, is that under extreme exploitation, the size of adults decreases. And so therefore you're losing that effect of trying to maintain your largest individuals to provide reproductive output. So there's definitely a role there in trying to maintain the largest individuals, because they will again have the genetic structure transmitted through their larvae to reproduce large individuals. So you don't want to genetically structure or stunt your population due to high fishing pressures.
And let me just add really briefly for the understanding of everybody, the reason the cavity that we've talked about several times, Nelson has mentioned it several times, conch only lay shell down from within. They cannot make their shell outside. They can only use their mantle to lay down shell material from within. So they basically, over time, will entomb themselves in their own shell. And that's what we talk about, the cavity getting smaller. And the lip thickness is also grown from the lower part of the lip. That's where the shell material is laid down by the mantle tissue.
Thank you, Alex. We do have two questions coming in from Lionel from Honduras. Firstly, he asked for some further clarification or explanation of the alley effect, but also questioned whether there were adult conch at 40 meters depth and beyond.
The second question, we explore to a maximum of 120 feet, which is 40 meters. Only in a few occasions because of the obviously difficulty of diving at that depth, that you can be there for very short time under very precarious conditions, etc. The densities were pretty high, in fact, for that depth. And as I said, we cover, I'm trying to remember exactly so many years ago, but it was in a couple of occasions only, and the stock was there. So how much deeper? No idea, no idea. Probably cameras should be used for that purpose. The alley effect, as we were saying, if you take, for example, one of the fishing grounds in the Honduras, Nicaragua's rise, and all the fleets start taking the resource in the way, the major amounts every year, obviously the density of the stock is decreasing. So if that stock is a mature stock and a spawning stock, obviously they're going to have problems in finding males and females to fertilize each other. And the problem is then the alley effect. Your recruitment will be affected because there is just few egg material in the water after the spawning season.
Yes, if I may just simplify that. A normal fishery model would say that your reproduction output decreases as your the density or abundance of your adults goes down, and will hit the axis at 0, 0. Whereas in a Lee effect, your reproductive output hits the 0 axis well before your adult density gets to 0. So that's the difference there. And I'd like to address the depth issue. Using ROVs, the deepest that I know of that a conch has been recorded is 70 meters. And that was with an ROV. I've seen one at 60 meters with lots of tracks in the sand indicating there's lots of activity going there, but it wasn't a survey. It was a drift dive because the current was so strong. But in Puerto Rico on the west coast, there's kind of a secondary shelf at 50 meters, and people using rebreathers have documented that population fairly well. It's reasonably dense. There is reproduction going on, although to what degree, that was not quantified. But that's also a very narrow strip of habitat. So yes, the conch can be at these deeper depths, and perhaps at density, but the extent of that distribution is still very much an open question, and to what degree that they would be reproducing is also open.
Alex?
Yeah, so the whole discussion of deep water conch has been the subject of internal discussions with the technical group over many years, and obviously, as the shallow water populations get exploited and overexploited, people want to go deeper. This is certainly a conversation, but I always think about it sort of juxtapose the exploitable biomass potential versus the reproductive reserve potential. So and again, the question of whether these animals are reproductively active or mating and spawning at these deep depths is still in question. But even from a more practical standpoint, the idea of sending divers, these animals are hand collected to anything beyond 40 meters. I mean, I've been diving to 60 meters. It is a technical problem for our bodies to be spending any kind of time at depth. And given the very poor conditions I've seen of diving equipment by tank divers, hookah divers, and even the dangers of free diving to anything to 30 meters or below is something that should be concerning to all the managers of these resources. I don't think we should be putting people who are trying to earn a livelihood into that sort of extreme environment where they can be physically hurt or even die to collect animals that are used for a food. Again, managing the shallower stocks and perhaps considering those deep animals as the reproductive reserve is maybe the more sort of conservative approach here.
Thank you, Alex. I also just want to make mention of something that has been posted in the chat. Rich alluded to the genetics project and currently ongoing. Karen has posted the contact information of Dr. Diana Beltran from the University of Rhode Island. And she has also posted a link to the notification that was sent to parties so you can know a little bit more about this work. And Krista has just mentioned within the chat an agreement about doing deep water assessments using an ROV. There does not seem to be any more questions, but I will also just make mention. Wait, there was a question with regards to recommendations regarding the lip thickness at which collection should or should not occur, and also that it was mentioned that if adult density was very high, competition can hinder reproduction, whereas if adult density is too low, encounters are insufficient, and whether it was possible to determine a recommended adult density to maintain a stable population. This question was already answered within the chat, but I don't know if any of the consultants want to share any more information just for the benefit of the general audience.
Well, I would make a comment. First of all, the concept of density is very dependent on, and the interpretation of it is very dependent on the area over which your surveys are done. And so I'll call attention to a study done by Delgado and Glazer, who were looking within spawning aggregations, and they were not finding signs of reproductive activity until those densities got very high, 800, 1,000, 2,000 conch per hectare. So, but this is in a spawning aggregation. It is not a population density per se. So when we talk about densities and how high was it going to be to affect reproduction, we don't know, because during the the spawning season, the conch can come together and form very high locally dense populations. That's not really affecting their ability to reproduce. It's probably enhancing that, but in terms of their livelihood throughout the year, they're probably using a larger area for feeding and whatnot. So, and we just don't have that kind of data. There just aren't that many studies, and everybody's kind of looking at things slightly differently.
And as a follow-up to lip thickness, Abigail Quiroz asked whether there were any documented studies concerning individuals found in shallow waters with a shell length under 177 millimeters, but a lip thickness greater than 5 millimeters.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, again, the size of the adult is determined at the maximum size of the juvenile, and the size of the juvenile is determined by the habitat that it's lived in and the food resources that it was able to consume to grow. So juvenile conchs want to get as big as possible, as soon as possible, to avoid predator gape size, but those can be limited. So there is, we don't know every detail about it, but there is some point in the early life history, 3 to 4 years old, and Rich can elaborate or correct me, that they will basically stop growing in shell length, which is along the axis from the tip of the spire to the siphonal canal, and will start growing that shell lip. And that will be the maximum size. And that is what determines ultimately its contribution.
I think we might have
Was
temporary disruption with Alex. We'll give it a couple more seconds, and then if not, I can hand over to Nelson and Rich if you had anything to add to that. But there is another sort of related question when it comes to lip thickness. So I think we can go on to that question, and if it's anything, we can always come back to Alex. So Kenneth from Belize has made an observation where in Belize they are observing a significant prevalence of what they call samba conch individuals that exhibit clear indications of morphometric maturity, i.e., flaring lips greater than 5 millimeters, despite having a total shell length well below the legal threshold of 178 millimeters. These specimens appear to be reaching a terminal size at approximately 150 millimeters shell length, and they are interested in determining if other jurisdictions are documenting similar evidence of stunted growth or localized phenotypic variations. And so the question is, have there been any recent studies or maturity assessments within the region that address these sublegal mature adults, and how are these being accounted for in current management or harvest strategies?
Alex will be the best to answer that question because he has been surveying on these matters.
Yeah. But I would say that, the whole question of samba conch is really driven by the kind of information that has come out of Belize historically. So I don't see these in my work in Puerto Rico or some of the other places I've worked. But the danger is, of course, is that these are really small, end up being small adults, and therefore just from that alone is their contribution in terms of number of eggs produced is going to be low. And if your population is genetically being driven in that direction, that's a really bad sign. And the fact that they're, sub-legal means they won't be, they're protected. So again, they might start contributing genetically a disproportionate amount, even though they are so small to begin with.
Since Alex has rejoined, I will repeat the question since you have been deemed the most suitable to respond. So Kenneth from Belize was sharing an observation where of the Samba conch individuals that exhibit clear indications of morphometric maturity, where the flaring lips are greater than 5 millimeters, despite having a total shell length well below 178 millimeters. And they appear to be reaching a terminal size at approximately 150 millimeters. And so the question was, have there been any recent studies or maturity assessments within the region that address these sublegal mature adults? And how are these being accounted for in current management or harvest strategies?
Yeah, so Kenneth, I think you're talking about the fairly large population of what's called Samba regionally, the miniaturized conchs at Lighthouse Atoll. That's the data that I've seen there. These animals, as we illustrated at Glover's, are pushing towards the smaller sizes, because over time, the largest juveniles, and everybody should be aware that there's a juvenile sub-adult fishery in Belize that goes by shell length. That the largest animals and the quickest growers have been taken out of the population. So from a perhaps a genetic standpoint, the biggest animals have been removed, and the genetic information about those have been removed. So you've selected towards the smaller individuals. Now these smaller individuals do not they're not harvestable based on the shell length, because they're below 176 millimeters. So they're illegal to take in terms of the law in Belize. So that's, for me, it's sort of an incentive to move away from a shell length regulation and towards more of a shell lip regulation, where you might be able to build back your larger adults. And as I joined back, Rich was talking about the larger or the smaller animals have less individual contribution to the overall fecundity of the population. I mean, their meat is fine, but they're very small. And they're even if you're managing your fishery based on meat production, you do want the juveniles to get as big as possible, not only to contribute to fecundity and reproduction and recruitment, but to maximize meat size. So these are all things to consider, and that we've illustrated in some publications, which happy to share with you.
Thank you, Alex. We do have Marco from Honduras also add in a comment that they have also observed the presence of the Samba that are morphometrically mature individuals, and similar to what is being described in Belize, they are seeing adults with well-developed flared lips that meet or exceed their maturity criteria, but their total shell length still remains below the legal threshold. So thank you, Marco from Honduras, for that comment. As of now, I don't see, oh, there is one more question here. Is there any regional study on conch shells and ocean acidification? And the question has to do with whether the Samba population is different, or are they affected, resulting in smaller shells?
Well, I'll add a quick comment here. I mean, I first encountered conch in any number in Jamaica in fairly deep and sparse food conditions on Pedro Bank. So there we saw what we described as an accumulation of medium to smaller conch, which were very old. And their shell was being, and this is natural, being attacked by various, and I'm frozen again. I think I'm frozen again, or no?
You're fine now.
Okay. So this idea, like, we'll touch on the acidification in a moment, but there is a natural, with age, dissolution of the outer part of the shell when you have a lot of things like boring sponges and other symbionts that are, adhering in a little mini ecosystem on the shells. And I've seen very old conch that literally look like a stone with no spines because of the erosion of just being alive for decades and being attacked, so to speak, by animals that are breaking up their outer shell, but they're still growing shell on the inside and becoming that small cavity that we spoke about. So the ocean acidification problem is, something beyond what we've discussed. I think we might have mentioned it in the guidance as an environmental issue in the medium to long term. But this idea of small conch is generally due to poor habitat or fishing pressure that has removed the largest and fastest growing individuals, because they will stop growing in their length when they start to mature, and ballpark 3 to 4 years old. And Rich, again, if you have any additions to that.
Yeah, a couple of things. First, for acidification, in most places, conch are growing up in a very carbonate-rich environment. And so the local conditions around them are somewhat buffered from the effects of acidification. So, while it may, and certainly in the future, impact their ability to grow shell, it's not the choke point. The choke point's going to be in the larval stage, when they're up in the water column and away from that carbonate-rich environment, that we would expect acidification to have an issue. With respect to, I'm going to say I forgot the question, but we were talking about the
smaller shells.
Yeah, the smaller shells. I've had some stunted individuals that I've grown in the lab, and that occurred because, again, they just weren't getting the conditions that they needed. And so they actually went beyond the normal time of maturation, but they weren't really growing any. And then finally they just give up and mature to small size. But there's, very little work, and I would go back to maybe Acalato's studies in the, whenever that was, late 70s, that have looked at conditions and growth rates relative to final sizes. But generally, it's, if you grow slow, you're going to end up being small.
And let me just briefly add that the extreme conditions with respect to reducing shell length, I experienced at the Caicos Conch Farm in the late 90s, where we had thousands of individuals per hectare in pens and feeding them with prepared conch specific pellet food. But what came out of that is what we tried to market as bonsai conch. These are shell lengths of under 150 millimeters and thick lips. So the conditions of the habitat and the available food supply are the primary, sort of outside the extractive system, are the primary parameters that will motivate shell length growth. If they have poor food, which for an example, Pedro Bank is an underwater desert for very large areas with very poor food, detrital particles might be the main food, gleaning that from the sand. It's a poor environment to grow in. But if it's been unharvested for hundreds or even thousands of years, you had this buildup of biomass that was eventually harvested, and then that harvest level was weaned down over a decade to what they have in Jamaica right now, about 400 metric tons. So that was a management decision to lower production and extraction levels based on the biology of the animals in that particular area, those particular fishing grounds.
Thank you, Alex. I think we can take one more question, and this comes from Andre. It's a request for you to answer. He wants you to speak to the impractical metric of lip thickness for fisheries that remove the meat under the water. And also a request for you to discuss the use of the state of the sex organs or other methods as a guidance to determine the state of maturity for management purposes.
This is to me?
In general, to the group about this is from Andre Kong as a request to share some more information. Nelson.
Yes, hi, Andre. The situation with cleaning the conch down there the depth and leaving the shell behind makes the lip idea absolutely obsolete unless the divers are really educated on the value of leaving those that are not mature. But this adds another caveat to the entire system. There are about 3 to 5 conchs per 1 pound of clean meat, okay? And that is to mean that we need to think in 3 to 5 shells per pound of clean meat. And when you're talking about 1 million or 2 million pounds, you are talking about millions and millions of shells that are left behind there. And the question is, and we had some conversations with the consultants, what is the impact, the ecological impact to the conch population that their own spawning grounds are filled with shells? And obviously, there are all kinds of opinions on this. And probably that is one problem that we have, that the divers are not going to bring the weight all the way to the surface, period. I mean, that is the situation. So if they can crack the conch down there, they will send the dirty meat, part of the dirty meat up, and the guy in the dinghy will finish cleaning the conch. But it is not practical and especially very difficult to enforce. So, Andre, I guess that is what is my little bit here. Perhaps Alex has more comments on this.
Well, I do, because we did a study in Puerto Rico. So this is not an industrial fishery. It's a artisanal one. And they actually have a dual regulation of a minimum length or a minimum lip thickness. And they wanted to know how could they enforce that through whatever was landed, which is not with the shell. So we did a study of that, and that combination is actually somewhat unique. It allows us to look at what's landed, which is the dirty meat. It's with importantly with the operculum. And so using a combination of observing whether they have mature sex structures, male or female, or an operculum length of, and I forget what it is off the top of my head, X amount, we could safely say that easily 90% of the conch in a catch could be determined accurately to be legal or not. And it was higher than that, but we recommended, okay, let 10% of the catch miss that, you'll still be okay. But that's in a situation where you've got something to look at. If you're talking about industrial fishery, well, the sex structures are removed, the operculum is removed, and all you have is weight. Now, you could go back to what Nelson mentioned was the number of conch per pound. And if you have a mean and variance on that, you could set limits that say, okay, this proportion of your catch must meet this thing. And, and what we found out is if you tried to cheat and say, okay, I can get 10%, that's illegal, you'll go over the limit because it's already rigged to just meet what's legal. So if you can do that and you're not in a situation where you're genetically driving your population to smaller sizes, using conversion factors, you should be able to come up with and say, on average, if you're hitting this many animals per pound or kilogram at over what level cleaned, you must be on average really dealing with mature adults. But you'd have to do all the studies to do that. The other way is if you don't clean them, you can at least say they have to be mature. And that you just look at the sex organs there. But again, you can't take those out through the processing before the assessment's made. And
So
that's just a one, if you take 50% mature at say 10 millimeter lip thickness, right there, half your population is not going to meet that. You would have to set the limits higher for you to say, or you'd have to say, okay, 50% have to show signs of maturity, but there's no clean way of doing it. But there are ways you could get close, and you just say, okay, that's what we're going to do, and we accept the hit and miss aspect of that.
So I would just add that I think from the video that Nelson showed in the Bahamas, even in a modern fishery, they're expecting the shells to be landed with the animals still in it, because they're at a point, and again, I don't know the most recent situation, but they're at a point where they're very concerned with their conch populations and would like to see the animals in the shell, which is the easiest way to sort of detect if they're mature or not. In Belize, we worked with fishermen and gave them one simple instruction: bring us conch that you would harvest. And then we looked at all the aspects of those conchs, the shells, the sex organs, the dirty conch, so that is all the organs attached, and the what they call market clean, trimmed, about 65% clean, we would call it, and got all those in line and tried to understand finally what would be a mature meat weight at 65% clean. And that is possible to do in cooperation with the fishing industry. And I think for all concerned, preserving those sorts of regulations, and again, we're usually talking only about 50%. We're not talking about 100%, but there's going to be the point is that there's going to be enough mature animals that survive the fishery to mate, create egg masses, and recruit new animals to the fishery and perpetuate the system.
Thank you, Alex. I just want to bring mention to Michelle, who I believe is from Curacao, added a comment that they had a few 4.5-year-old conch in a hatchery in a small tank and possibly suboptimal food, and he was confirming that they stayed under 15 centimeters without any sign of lip development and very low growth rate. And then also making mention that Karen shared a link about the Blue Biotrade project, which seeks to find markets for all parts of the conch as a measure to try to encourage fishers to generate the same income from harvesting fewer conch. So there are some resources within the chat. And since we do have time, I think we can take this final question from Yamira Fuentes from WCS in Belize. And she asked whether is it that the samba that they are seeing in Belize is a hybrid of queen conch crossing with milk conch, which shares the same habitat?
Well, I would say, without some genetic analysis, I would doubt that they were a hybrid. This is the idea that they've been in a poor habitat and have been not harvested because of their shell length is under the legal limit of 176 millimeters in Belize, and they've been left. So they're surviving on whatever resources are there. If you could do some genetic sampling and show a hybridization, that would be a very unique piece of the literature that we don't have.
Yeah, I would add, for the small conch that we have in Puerto Rico, which, get down to maybe 180 millimeters, they're clearly queen conch. I mean, morphologically and everything. Now, I do have one fisherman who claims that he found what he really thought was the hybrid, both from the shell and from the morphology. Unfortunately, he was not successful in getting us the tissue in time to do the genetic analysis on that. But this is somebody, who harvests thousands of conch, thousands and thousands of conch, and he's seen this once. So it's unlikely that you have populations of hybrids. And we can't even confirm that one was a hybrid.
No.
But he's a keen observer.
Thank you, Rich. And there is a comment from Marco from Honduras, where he is mentioning that they collect queen conch samples, both shell and tissue, from each authorized vessel during their fishing operations, and this allows them to perform morphometric measurements and apply various types of biological processing to estimate conversion factors. They currently maintain an extensive and continuously expanding database that integrates multiple years and fishing banks. So thank you, Marco, for sharing that information. We are just about 5 minutes away from wrapping up today. I'll hand it over to the consultants whether there are any final remarks, or if not, I will wrap up for today. Any final comments?
Simply say that these opportunities that we have in this webinar are so unique, and I appreciate the exchange of ideas and questions, and it's the only way that we are going to truly build up some strong scientific support for what has to be done with queen conch in the Caribbean. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Nelson. If there aren't any comments, I'd like to sort of provide a wrap up of today. We started off with some welcoming words from the Secretary General of CITES, and then Karen took us through an introduction to the workshop, establishing the foundation on which this is built, the history of queen conch and CITES, introduction to the CITES NDF project, and then also the objectives of this workshop. And then Nelson really provided the foundation, the scientific and technical foundation for exploited population dynamics, which will be further developed by Rich tomorrow on day 2, where we will start to look at the NDF guidance that was prepared by this team. Looking into the queen conch NDF scoring system, a description of the guidance steps and the worksheets, including using some theoretical scoring examples. We will have another extensive question and answer session, and then we'll finish up with any next steps, whether it be the testing of the guidance, targeted support, and any feedback. So we do want to encourage this level of interaction and sharing of information from all our attendees, and we are really grateful for everyone attending today. And we look forward to continuing this discussion tomorrow. We will be starting once again at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And so thank you again to everyone for your participation today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.